Hey there, fellow time travellers. Tonight we're cracking open the past, and fair warning, it's nothing like the tidy version your teacher fed you. People once ate ground-up mummies as medicine, decorated their nurseries with arsenic-soaked wallpaper, and sipped cocaine straight from a bottle stamped good for your health. History, it turns out, was absolutely losing its mind. So buckle up. This is not a dusty textbook. It's a greatest hits collection of the weirdest, darkest, and silliest true stories the past ever coughed up. Every one of them real and documented, no matter how bonkers it sounds. We're going from America's first serial killers to a teenage boy who appeared out of nowhere, with no past and one very fancy scarf. Before we dive in, tell me down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now wherever you are. Now dim the lights, get comfy, and let's go digging. Ready? Let's roll. Let's begin with something that sounds almost insultingly dull on paper. Spices. The little jars gathering dust at the back of your cupboard, the cinnamon you forget to use, the pepper grinder that comes out twice a year. Today these things cost roughly nothing, and you treat them with all the reverence of a paper napkin. But rewind a few centuries and that exact same handful of dried plant matter could buy a house, fund a war, sink a navy, and rearrange the political map of the entire planet. People killed for it. Empires rose and collapsed over it. And the single most valuable real estate deal in human history, the one that handed the world the city of New York, was settled because two countries could not stop arguing about a nut. So before we get to the killers and the mysteries, let's talk about how a pinch of seasoning quietly built the modern world. Picture yourself as a reasonably comfortable merchant in medieval Europe. You have a roof, you have some land, you have a few sheep wandering around looking smug. Now imagine that a single pound of ginger, the kind you would today toss into a stir-fry without a second thought, is worth one of those sheep, an entire living animal traded for a sack of dried root. Pepper was treated less like food and more like currency. Rents were paid in it, dowries were measured in it, and a man could leave peppercorns to his heirs in his will, as though he were bequeathing gold bars, which, in fairness, was the closest comparison available. There is even a faint echo of all this still hiding in modern English. When we talk about a peppercorn rent, a payment so tiny it is basically symbolic, we are accidentally quoting a time when a few peppercorns were a perfectly serious sum. The meaning has flipped completely, which the medieval pepper baron would have found either hilarious or deeply offensive. Now here is where school did you dirty, because there is one explanation for all this that gets repeated everywhere, and it is mostly nonsense. You have probably heard that spices were so prized because medieval food was rancid, and people needed strong flavours to disguise the taste of meat that had gone off. It is a tidy little story. It is also backwards. Think about it for a second. Spices were the single most expensive thing a person could buy. The people who could afford pepper and cloves and saffron were, by definition, fabulously wealthy, and wealthy people do not eat spoiled meat. They had the money for the freshest cuts, the best larders, and servants whose entire job was to make sure the master was not served anything questionable. Nobody dropped a small fortune on cinnamon to rescue a chicken that had clearly given up on life days earlier. If your dinner was rotten, you simply did not eat it, because you were rich enough to have another one. So if it was not about hiding bad meat, what was the point? The honest answer is the most human one imaginable. Spices were about showing off. They were the medieval equivalent of parking a supercar in your driveway, where the neighbours could see it. When a nobleman hosted a feast and his food arrived practically glowing with rare seasonings hauled halfway across the known world, every guest understood the message instantly. This man has reach. This man has money to burn. This man can summon flavours that grow on the other side of the earth and have them on his table by Tuesday. A heavily spiced dish was a status symbol you could taste, and the more exotic and obscure the spice, the louder the boast. There were also genuine beliefs that spices were good for the body, balancing mysterious internal humours and warding off disease, which is a charming theory and also completely wrong, but at least it gave people a reason beyond pure vanity to keep buying the stuff. Of course, none of this explains the truly insane prices, and the prices were insane for one beautifully simple reason. Nobody in Europe had the faintest idea where any of it actually came from. The spices arrived from somewhere far to the east, that much was clear, but the supply chain was a black box guarded by an unbroken chain of middlemen, each of whom had a powerful financial interest in keeping the next link a secret. By the time a peppercorn reached a market stall in Venice or London, it had changed hands more times than a rumour at a family reunion, and every single hand had taken its cut and added a markup. The merchants selling the stuff actively encouraged wild stories about where it grew, partly to justify the cost and partly because mystery is excellent for business. There were tales of cinnamon being collected from the nests of enormous birds perched on impossible cliffs, and of spices guarded by serpents that had to be driven off with fire. Were these stories true? Absolutely not. Did they help keep the price of cinnamon roughly equal to the price of a small miracle? They did indeed. To understand how the spices got to Europe at all, you have to follow one of the oldest trade arteries on the planet, a network so important it had its own name. The incense route ran for thousands of miles, carrying frankincense, myrrh, and a dazzling cargo of eastern luxuries up through the Arabian deserts toward the markets of the Mediterranean. This was not a road in any sense you would recognize. There was no pavement, no signage, and certainly no rest stops. Just an endless procession of camel caravans plodding across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, navigating by landmarks and starlight, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of traders who had every reason not to write any of it down. Crossing a desert with a fortune in spices strapped to your animals was not a relaxing way to make a living, and the people who did it were not running a charity. They were running the medieval equivalent of an armoured convoy, and they charged accordingly. Sitting astride this route like a spider in the centre of its web was the city of Petra, carved directly into rose-coloured stone in what is now Jordan. The people who built it, the Nabateans, grew staggeringly rich for one reason and one reason only. They controlled the water. In a desert, whoever controls the wells controls everything, and the Nabateans had turned the management of scarce water into a fine art, building hidden cisterns and channels that let their city flourish in a place that should by all rights have been empty sand. Every caravan that wanted to pass through their territory paid for the privilege, and since the alternative was dying of thirst in a wasteland, the caravans paid up without much argument. It was, when you think about it, one of history's most elegant business models. Own the only gas station for 1,000 miles and you never have to worry about repeat customers. Further along the chain came Alexandria, the great Egyptian port where the overland routes met the sea, and where eastern goods were funneled into the wider Mediterranean trade. And presiding over the whole arrangement, the ultimate gatekeeper, was a single city that turned the spice trade into one of the most profitable bottlenecks ever devised. The Silk Road, that famous tangle of routes carrying goods between China and the West, did not actually end in Europe. It poured its riches into the eastern Mediterranean, and almost everything that flowed west had to squeeze through one specific point, the magnificent, fabulously wealthy, strategically perfect city that straddled the crossing between Asia and Europe. If you wanted eastern silk or eastern spice, your goods were almost certainly passing through that single choke point, and the people who held it were collecting a toll on the trade of two continents. It was a brilliant position to occupy. It was also, eventually, a fatal one to be standing on when somebody decided they wanted it for themselves. That somebody arrived in 1453 when the great city fell to the Ottoman Empire after a siege that ended an era. For Europe, the immediate consequence was less spiritual and more commercial, and frankly, a little petty. The old comfortable arrangement, where European merchants bought their spices from intermediaries who bought them from other intermediaries, suddenly looked far less appealing now that the final gateway was controlled by a rival power that could set whatever terms it liked. Prices naturally did not go down. And so a question began to nag at the more ambitious minds of Europe, a question that would launch ships, drown sailors, and redraw the borders of the world. What if you could cut out the middlemen entirely? What if, instead of buying spices from a long chain of merchants each taking their slice, you could sail directly to wherever the spices actually grew, fill your hold, and sail home? Whoever managed that would not just make money, they would make the kind of money that builds dynasties. The first nation to take this idea seriously and act on it was Portugal, a small country with a long coastline and an enormous appetite for the unknown. The Portuguese reasoned that if Europe was at the top left of the map and the spices were somewhere far to the east, then surely a determined sailor could simply follow the coast of Africa south, find the bottom of the continent, turn the corner, and keep going until he bumped into the source. This sounds straightforward when you say it quickly. In practice, it meant sailing into waters that no European had ever charted, with crews convinced that the sea might literally boil at the equator or drop off the edge of the world, and no way of knowing how far the coast of Africa actually extended, because as far as anyone knew it might go on forever. Year after year, Portuguese expeditions crept a little further south, planting stone markers as they went, and year after year the coast stubbornly refused to end. Then, in 1488, a captain named Bartolomeo Diaz finally did it. He was driven south by a brutal storm, lost sight of land entirely, and when he turned back toward the coast, he discovered to his astonishment that Africa was now to his north. He had been blown clean around the bottom of the continent without even seeing it. The Great Barrier had been passed. The way east lay open. Diaz wanted to push on, but his exhausted and frankly terrified crew had reached the firm conclusion that they had volunteered for quite enough adventure for one lifetime, and they more or less insisted on going home. The cape at the tip of Africa earned a fittingly dramatic name born of all the storms and shipwrecks it had caused, though it was later rebranded into something more optimistic for the benefit of nervous investors, because nobody wants to fund a voyage that has to round a cape openly advertising its body count. While Portugal was methodically inching down the coast of Africa, a far more reckless idea was taking shape in the mind of a Genoese sailor with a flair for confident miscalculation. His name was Christopher Columbus, and his pitch was gloriously simple. The earth is round, he argued, which everyone educated already knew, so why bother going all the way around Africa at all? Just sail west across the open ocean, and you will eventually arrive at the east. It is the same destination from the opposite direction. The logic was sound. The math, however, was a catastrophe. Columbus had badly underestimated the size of the Earth and badly overestimated the size of Asia, which conveniently combined to produce a westward ocean voyage that looked short, achievable, and not at all likely to end in everyone starving to death in the middle of an empty sea. The scholars who reviewed his numbers told him, correctly, that he was wrong and that the ocean was far wider than he believed. They just did not happen to know that there was an entire pair of continents sitting in the gap, waiting to catch him. So in 1492, funded at last after years of rejection, Columbus sailed west looking for a shortcut to the spice lands of the east, and instead ran headlong into the Americas, a landmass nobody in Europe knew existed. He went to his grave insisting he had reached the outskirts of Asia, which is a bit like booking a flight to Tokyo, landing in a place that is very obviously not Tokyo, and announcing to the cabin crew that you have arrived, and the brochures were simply inaccurate. The spices he was hunting were nowhere to be found because he was on the wrong side of the planet. But the accidental discovery would reshape history just as profoundly as any cargo of pepper, even if it was, from the strict perspective of the original business plan, a total failure to deliver the product. For about a century, the seafaring nations of Europe scrambled over these new sea routes, and the Portuguese in particular grew rich on the eastern spice trade they had fought so hard to reach. But the true masters of the game, the players who turned the spice trade from a profitable adventure into a ruthless and almost terrifyingly modern machine, were not the Portuguese, they were the Dutch. And the instrument they built to do it was an invention so consequential that we are still living inside its shadow today. In 1602, the Dutch merged a cluster of competing trading ventures into a single enormous entity called the Dutch East India Company. You will most often see it referred to by the initials of its Dutch name, the VOC, and what those three letters represented was nothing less than the birth of the modern corporation. This is the part that genuinely deserves a pause, because it is easy to skim past it as a dry footnote about commerce, when it is in fact one of the most important inventions in human history, right up there with the wheel and writing, just considerably less photogenic. The VOC was the first company in the world to issue shares to the general public. For the first time, an ordinary person who had nothing to do with sailing or trading could walk in, hand over their savings, and own a tiny slice of an enormous commercial enterprise, collecting a portion of the profits without ever setting foot on a ship or smelling a single peppercorn. The entire concept of the stock market, of publicly traded companies, of the financial architecture that runs the global economy to this day, traces its lineage directly back to a Dutch outfit that existed to sell you nutmeg. Every time someone checks their retirement fund or watches a stock ticker scroll across a screen, they are, in a very real sense, participating in a system that was invented to corner the market on cloves. And the VOC was not a company in any sense you would recognize from the modern world, where corporations at least pretend to operate within the bounds of national law. This was a corporation with the powers of a sovereign state. It could negotiate treaties with foreign rulers as an equal. It could mint its own coinage. It could establish colonies, build forts, and, most alarmingly, it could wage war. At its peak, the VOC commanded a private army of around 30,000 soldiers and a fleet of roughly 200 warships, which is to say it possessed more military force than most actual countries of its time. Imagine if a modern coffee chain not only sold you a latte, but also maintained its own navy, and occasionally invaded small nations that were slow to sign supply contracts. That is roughly the energy the VOC brought to the simple business of acquiring spices, and it is the reason the company's name still carries a chill among the people of the islands it descended upon. The crown jewel of the whole obsession was a single spice that grew, at the time, in only one place on Earth: nutmeg. Today, it is the thing you grate over eggnog and then forget about for another year. But in this era, it was worth a fortune so absurd that a sailor who managed to smuggle home a small bag of it could retire comfortably for life. And the entire global supply came from a tiny scattering of volcanic specks in the eastern seas known as the Banda Islands. Whoever controlled those few small islands controlled the world's supply of nutmeg, and therefore controlled a money-printing operation of staggering proportions. The VOC looked at this arrangement, where the spice grew in one tiny place and the profits were beyond imagining, and arrived at a chillingly logical business conclusion. To own the trade completely, they would need to own the islands completely. What happened in 1621 on the Banda Islands was, by any measure, one of the darkest chapters of the entire age of trade, and I am not going to dwell on the grim particulars, because the broad fact is harrowing enough on its own. In its determination to seize an absolute monopoly over nutmeg, the company set out to crush the native Bandanese population and their independent control of the trade. The thriving community that had lived on and traded from those islands for generations was almost entirely wiped out, through killing, expulsion, and enslavement, until the population had collapsed from many thousands to a small remnant. The islands were then carved up into plantations and worked by people brought in from elsewhere under brutal conditions, also that a board of directors thousands of miles away could guarantee that every nutmeg on Earth passed through their hands first. It is a sobering reminder that behind the cosy spice rack and the holiday baking lies a history that was, for the people who actually lived where the spices grew, absolutely catastrophic. The price of that nutmeg was paid in something far heavier than silver. The Dutch had nearly total control, but not quite total, and the reason was a single stubborn holdout, a tiny island called Run, no more than a sliver of rock and trees, but covered in the nutmeg trees that made it priceless. And on Run, of all the unlikely things, the English had planted a flag. For years, the two trading powers squabbled bitterly over this microscopic dot, because in the brutal arithmetic of monopoly, even one island outside your control means the supply is not truly yours. The dispute dragged on as part of the larger rivalry between the two nations, until finally the diplomats sat down to sort out who got what, in a treaty signed in 1667. And here we arrive at one of the single most jaw-dropping trades in all of recorded history, a swap so lopsided that it reads like a riddle. In that treaty, the English agreed to hand over their claim to the island of Run, surrendering it to the Dutch and giving them at last their cherished total monopoly over nutmeg, and in exchange the Dutch agreed to give up their claim to a different territory on the other side of the world, a place they had been holding that the English had recently seized. That Dutch territory was a settlement called New Amsterdam, sitting on an island at the mouth of a great river in North America. The Dutch, looking at a worthless strip of cold colonial coastline versus a guaranteed monopoly on the most valuable spice on the planet, felt they had absolutely fleeced the gullible English. They walked away from the table convinced they had made the deal of the century. New Amsterdam, that muddy little nothing of a trading post, was renamed by its new English owners in honour of a royal duke, becoming New York. Run remained a tiny, eventually irrelevant island whose great prize, the nutmeg monopoly, evaporated within a few decades once the trees were quietly smuggled out and planted elsewhere, shattering the very monopoly the whole bloody contest had been fought to protect. The Dutch had traded away the future capital of global finance for a spice island that stopped mattering almost immediately, which is the kind of investment decision that haunts a nation's nightmares. And that is the strange and slightly unsettling truth at the heart of this whole story. The global economy that surrounds us, the stock exchanges, the multinational corporations, the very idea that you can own a piece of a company you will never visit, all of it grew out of Europe's helpless craving for the contents of your spice cabinet. Pepper built fleets, nutmeg built the first true corporation, and cost an entire island its people, and the most famous city on earth changed hands over an argument about seasoning, The next time you grind a little black pepper over your dinner without thinking, remember that the same gesture once moved the world. Which brings us, by way of fortunes and empires and the things people will do for something rare and valuable, to a mystery about a person who arrived in the world with no fortune at all, no name worth mentioning, and no past that anyone has ever been able to explain. On the evening of the 26th of May, 1828, in the German city of Nuremberg, a cobbler was crossing a quiet public square when he noticed a teenage boy standing strangely near the edge of it. There was nothing immediately alarming about a young man loitering in a square, but something about this one was deeply off, and the longer the cobbler looked, the stranger it got. The boy appeared to be around 16 years old, and he was dressed in clothes that did not fit and did not match, the sort of mismatched rags a person ends up in when nobody has bothered to dress them properly. But it was the way he moved that stopped people in their tracks. He walked, but barely, lurching and stumbling like a toddler taking first steps, as though his legs had simply never been used for the ordinary business of getting around. He could hold himself upright just about, but every step looked like a small negotiation between his body and the ground was winning. When people approached him, the strangeness only deepened. He could speak, but only barely, and what he said made no sense. He seemed able to produce just a single coherent sentence, repeated over and over regardless of what anyone asked him. A phrase to the effect that he wanted to be a cavalryman, a rider, just as his father had been before him. Beyond that, he was nearly mute. He did not seem to understand most of what was said to him, and he reacted to ordinary objects and ordinary sounds as though encountering them for the first time, with a mixture of fear and bewildered fascination. He recoiled from open flame as though it were a living predator. The light of day appeared to physically pain him, and he squinted and flinched against it in a way that suggested his eyes had spent very little time in the sun. Handed a candle, he reached for the bright flame with the unguarded curiosity of an infant, and was visibly shocked when it burned him, having apparently never learned the single most universal lesson of early childhood. The people who took him in tried, as anyone would, to feed the obviously starving young man, and here came another deeply unsettling clue. He would not touch most of what he was offered. Meat made him recoil. Beer, that staple of the region, repelled him. The only things he would willingly consume were plain bread and plain water, and he ate them as though they were the only foods he had ever known, which, the chilling implication ran, they very possibly were. Everything about him pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. This was a young man on the cusp of adulthood who appeared to have spent his entire life, every single year of it, in near total isolation. Someone who had never walked freely, never seen daylight, never eaten a proper meal, never learned to speak beyond a single planted phrase, and never experienced the ordinary world that the rest of us absorb so automatically we forget we ever had to learn it at all. On his person, the authorities found 2 objects, and these only thickened the fog. He was carrying a letter, addressed to a local cavalry captain, written in a tone that tried to explain his presence, and managed only to deepen the riddle. And far more puzzling than the letter, tucked among his ragged clothes, was an item that simply did not belong with the rest of him. It was a silk scarf, fine and expensive, the sort of accessory that speaks of money and good taste, utterly at odds with the half-starved, half-wild creature wearing rags who carried it. That single elegant scarf would become one of the great snags in the whole affair. A thread, quite literally, that hinted at a far grander origin than the boy's pitiful condition suggested. Why would a feral, neglected youth, apparently raised on bread and water in the dark, be in possession of a luxury item? It was the kind of detail that does not fit any simple story, and the affair was nothing but details that refused to fit. The boy was given a name, Caspar Hauser, and almost overnight he became a sensation. Word of the strange foundling spread across Germany and then across Europe, and people were captivated. Here, it seemed, was a real-life riddle made flesh. A young man who had somehow grown up entirely outside human society, and then been deposited, fully formed and utterly unequipped, into the middle of a busy city. Scholars, doctors, and the merely curious flocked to study him, to teach him, and to argue endlessly about what he was. The process of bringing him into normal life, of teaching him to speak, to walk properly, to eat ordinary food and behave like a person rather than a frightened animal, was watched by the public with the breathless attention we now reserve for the most addictive television, and Caspar, to his credit, learned. He picked up language with surprising speed, began to read and write, and slowly assembled a personality, a sharp and rather charming one, that delighted his many patrons. But as he learned to talk, the story he told only made things worse. Caspar began to describe his early life, and the picture he painted was one of almost unimaginable confinement. He claimed to have spent his entire existence locked alone in a tiny dark space, a cell barely large enough to sit in, never seeing the face of whoever kept him there. Food and water, he said, simply appeared while he slept. He had no concept of other people, no concept of the outside world, no sense that there was a sky or a sun or other human beings at all. According to his account, only at the very end, shortly before his release into the world, did a mysterious figure teach him to stand, to take a few steps, and to recite that single sentence about wanting to be a rider like his father. Then this person had brought him, disoriented and barely functional, to the edge of the city, and abandoned him in the square where he was found. It was a horrifying story, and the obvious question hung over all of it. Was any of it true? This is where the affair splits cleanly into two camps, and where, even now, intelligent and informed people land firmly on opposite sides. The first camp says the answer is simple and rather deflating. They argue that Caspar Hauser was, to put it bluntly, an extraordinarily gifted liar. In this reading, he was a runaway or an abandoned youth of ordinary if troubled origins, who discovered, perhaps by accident, that performing the role of the mysterious wild boy brought him an avalanche of attention, sympathy, comfortable lodging, and the devoted care of wealthy and important people. The medical term that gets applied here is a factitious disorder, the deep psychological drive to feign helplessness or illness in order to occupy the role of the cared for, the special, the studied. Skeptics point to inconsistencies in his stories, to his evident intelligence and quick wit, which sit awkwardly with a supposed lifetime of total mental isolation, and to a documented habit of theatrical behaviour. In this version, Caspar was less a tragic prisoner and more a brilliant performer who found the role of a lifetime and simply never stepped out of it. The second camp tells a far more dramatic story, one involving stolen birthrights, royal conspiracy, and murder. According to this theory, Caspar Hauser was not a nobody at all but a somebody, specifically a hidden heir to a ruling house, a baby of noble blood who had been secretly swapped out at birth and spirited away so that the succession could be diverted to someone else's advantage. In this reading, the rightful prince was not killed as an infant, perhaps out of some flicker of mercy, but was instead hidden away in lifelong confinement, raised in the dark precisely so that he would never be able to reveal who he was, never be able to read, write, or speak well enough to make a claim, never even know that a claim existed to be made. The expensive silk scarf in this version is not a loose end but a clue, a fragment of his lost noble origins that clung to him by accident. It is a story that has everything a great conspiracy needs: a stolen crown, an innocent victim, and powerful people with a powerful motive to keep a young man silent forever. And then the story takes the turn that lifts it out of the realm of mere curiosity and into something genuinely sinister, because Caspar Hauser did not simply fade into obscurity. Strange and frightening things began to happen to him. He survived an attack in which he was wounded, an incident he described as an attempt on his life by a hooded stranger, though skeptics noted pointedly that the wound could have been self-inflicted by someone desperate to keep public attention from drifting away. The episode revived all the speculation that powerful enemies were trying to silence him, and it cast a shadow of dread over the rest of his short life. Whether he was a hunted heir or a young man who had taken his performance to a dangerous extreme, the sense that something was closing in around him grew steadily, and it would not be long before the question was answered in the worst possible way. On the 14th of December, 1833, Caspar Hauser staggered home gravely injured. He had a deep wound in his chest, and he gave an account of having been lured to a secluded spot by a stranger who had handed him a bag and then struck him down. He clung to life for 3 days, and on the 17th of December he died. His last days were filled with the same ambiguity that had defined his entire existence, because even his death fit both theories with maddening neatness. To those who believed he was a murdered prince, this was the final act of the conspiracy. The silencing of the heir completed at last. The bag he was handed a lure designed to draw him to his killers. To the skeptics, it was a final performance gone tragically wrong. A man who had wounded himself to reclaim the spotlight one last time and had simply, fatally, cut too deep. The investigation found no clear culprit, no satisfying resolution, only the same fog that had surrounded him since the moment he first stumbled into that Nuremberg square. For more than a century afterward, the case sat exactly where it had been left. A perfect unsolved riddle with two equally compelling answers and no way to choose between them. And then, in the modern era, science arrived with what looked like the perfect tool to finally settle the question once and for all. In 1998, researchers obtained what was believed to be a sample of Caspar Hauser's blood, preserved on a piece of his clothing, and compared its genetic profile against descendants of the noble house he was supposedly born into. If the genetics matched, the murdered prince theory would be all but proven. The result was a quiet sensation, because the analysis indicated that the sample did not match the royal line. The hidden heir theory appeared to be dead. The skeptics permitted themselves a triumphant nod. Caspar Hauser, it seemed, had finally been unmasked as the impostor his doubters always suspected. Except science, like Caspar himself, refused to provide a clean ending. A few years later, in 2002, a fresh round of genetic testing was conducted, this time using different samples said to be connected to Caspar Hauser, drawn from items such as locks of his hair, and these new results pointed in the opposite direction, suggesting a genetic profile that was, intriguingly, compatible with the royal lineage after all. So now there were two scientific studies, each using physical material attributed to the same man, arriving at flatly contradictory conclusions. The reason for the contradiction is itself part of the puzzle. The samples were different. Hair from one source, blood from another, items separated by time and handling, and the simple uncertainty of whether any given relic truly belonged to Caspar Hauser at all. If even one of the samples had been mislabeled, contaminated, or wrongly attributed somewhere across the long decades, then one of the two studies was analysing the genetic material of a complete stranger and confidently drawing conclusions about the wrong person entirely. And so, after everything, after the centuries of speculation, the rival theories, the attempts on his life, his mysterious death, and even the cold precision of modern genetics, the case of Caspar Hauser remains exactly what it was on the day he first appeared, unsolved. Was he a tragic prisoner of a royal conspiracy, a stolen prince raised in darkness and eliminated to protect a throne? Or was he a brilliant, troubled young man who built the most elaborate false identity in history and committed to it so completely that it ultimately cost him his life? The expensive scarf, the single planted sentence, the lifetime in the dark, the wounds, the contradictory science, every piece of evidence can be read to support either answer, and none of it can be made to support only one. He arrived from nowhere and he departed into mystery, leaving behind a riddle that has outlived everyone who ever tried to solve it. The verdict, in the end, is yours. Read the clues, weigh the two stories, and tell me down in the comments which one you believe, the murdered prince or the master of disguise. From a riddle that Europe has never managed to solve, we cross the ocean to a place where, for a while, almost nobody was even trying to solve anything. Because if the old world had its mysteries, the young United States had something arguably more frightening. A vast stretch of land where the law simply had not arrived yet, where help was hundreds of miles away over terrain that did not care whether you lived or died, and where a traveller who vanished was more often than not quietly written off as one of the costs of moving west. It was into exactly this gap, this lawless seam in the fabric of a brand new nation, that two men stepped and earned a grim distinction. They are widely regarded as the first true serial killers in American history, and they were, depending on which family records you believe, either brothers or cousins, which gives you an early hint that nothing about these two was going to be tidy. Their names were Micajah Harp and Wiley Harp, though almost nobody bothered with the formal versions. Micajah was an enormous looming man, and so he became known simply as Big Harp. Wiley was the smaller of the pair, and so, with the brutal efficiency of frontier nicknaming, he became Little Harp. They were the sons of Scottish immigrants who had settled in North Carolina, and to understand how they became what they became, you first have to understand the world that produced them, because it was not the cosy, freshly painted picture of early America you might be carrying around in your head. The late 1700s on the American frontier were not, to put it gently, a golden age of public safety. The settled, governed parts of the country clung to the eastern seaboard, and the moment you pushed west into territories like Kentucky and Tennessee, you left behind very nearly everything we now think of as civilization. There were no police in any meaningful sense. There were no courts within easy reach, no telegraphs to send word ahead, no organised way to report that a crime had been committed, and frequently nobody to report it to, even if you tried. Communication moved at the speed of a horse, assuming the horse survived the journey, and news of a murder in one county might take weeks to reach the next, by which time the culprit could be 3 territories away under a different name. Justice, where it existed at all, was a do-it-yourself affair, administered by whatever group of armed neighbours could be assembled on short notice, which meant it was slow, patchy, and entirely dependent on someone first noticing that a wrong had been done. For a person inclined toward violence, this was less a deterrent and more an opportunity, an enormous and almost completely unsupervised hunting ground. Not exactly the noble pioneer adventure the paintings would have you believe. It helps to picture the actual landscape these people were moving through. Travellers heading west were not strolling down well-marked highways. They were following rough traces through dense forest, fording rivers, camping in the open, and trusting that the strangers they met along the way meant them no harm, because they had little choice. Inns and way stations were few and far between, and a tired family that came across a friendly group offering to share a fire for the night had every reason to be grateful, and almost no way to verify that their new companions were what they seemed. This was a world built on a fragile, necessary trust between strangers, and it was precisely that trust the Harps learned to exploit, which is part of what makes their story so unsettling. They did not have to break down any doors. They were often invited in. The Harps did not begin as killers. They began, like so many people on the frontier, as men shaped by a war. During the American Revolution, they took the losing side, siding with the British Crown as loyalists, and they reportedly did so with a viciousness that went well beyond ordinary soldiering. When the war ended badly for their cause, they did what countless displaced and embittered people did. They drifted west, away from the victorious new society that had no place for them, into the ungoverned lands where a man's past could be left behind as easily as a footprint. And somewhere out there, around the year 1798, whatever had been simmering inside them boiled over into a campaign of violence so relentless and so apparently motiveless that it baffled everyone who tried to make sense of it. Here is the detail that separates the Harps from the ordinary highway robbers of the era, the part that genuinely unsettled the people of the time. Most outlaws on the frontier killed for a reason, however ugly. They killed to rob, and once they had your money and your horse, they generally had no further interest in you. The Harps were different. They certainly robbed their victims, but the robbery often seemed almost incidental, an afterthought to the act of killing itself. They appeared to kill because they wanted to, because violence had become the entire point rather than a means to some other end, and that is a category of person the frontier was simply not equipped to imagine, let alone defend against. People could understand a thief. A thief, at least, operated by a logic you could predict and guard against. The Harps operated by no logic anyone could follow, which made them impossible to anticipate. A merchant could lock up his valuables, but you cannot lock up against a danger that does not want your valuables in the first place. They also had a method of concealing their crimes that was chillingly effective, and is the main reason we'll never know exactly how many people they killed. Rather than leave their victims where they fell, to be discovered and to raise an alarm, they took deliberate steps to make the bodies disappear entirely, weighting them down and consigning them to the rivers so that they would sink and never surface. A killing only becomes a known killing once someone finds the evidence, and a victim who is never found is, in the cold accounting of the frontier, simply a person who went west and was never heard from again, which described an enormous number of people for entirely innocent reasons. This is why the numbers attached to the Harps are so slippery. The figure most often repeated is 39 victims, but historians broadly agree the true total was almost certainly higher, quite possibly above 50, and the honest answer is that nobody knows and nobody ever will, because the whole point of their method was to make the counting impossible. We are left in the strange position of describing the careers of America's first serial killers, while admitting we cannot even confirm how many people they actually killed, an uncertainty that is itself part of the horror. I am going to handle the worst of what they did with a light touch, because the broad facts are disturbing enough without lingering over the particulars, and because 2 episodes in particular tell you everything you need to know about how far past any human boundary these men had travelled. The first involves their own group. The Harps did not travel alone. They were accompanied by women and, at one point, by an infant. And according to the accounts that have come down to us, when that infant's crying threatened to give away the group's position, Big Harp responded not as a father, but as a predator protecting his ability to hunt, and the child did not survive. It is, by every account, the one act that even Big Harp is said to have later expressed regret over, which tells you that he possessed at least a flicker of conscience, and somehow makes the whole thing more horrifying rather than less. This was a man capable of recognizing that he had crossed a line and capable of crossing it anyway. The women who travelled with them are their own small tragedy inside the larger one. They were, by the surviving accounts, bound to the Harps through a mixture of fear and dependence, dragged along through the wilderness as the killings mounted, and when the group was finally broken up, they were taken into custody themselves and questioned at length. They were ultimately not held responsible for the men's crimes, and were allowed to go on with their lives, which is about as close to mercy as this story gets, though it is hard to imagine what kind of life a person rebuilds after years spent in such company. For a stretch, the Harps found a natural habitat in the loose criminal world that haunted the great rivers, a world centred on a notorious spot that served as a kind of clubhouse for the region's outlaws, river pirates, and assorted villains. From hideouts like this, gangs would prey on the flatboats and travellers moving goods downriver, and a violent newcomer could blend into the crowd without anyone asking too many questions. But even among hardened criminals, the Harps reportedly stood out as too unpredictable and too fond of killing for its own sake, to the point that their fellow outlaws are said to have wanted them gone. When you're too disturbing for a den of river pirates, you have achieved a genuinely rare and unflattering distinction. The episode that finally brought the whole bloody chapter to an end happened because the Harps, for once, killed people whose disappearance would not be quietly absorbed by the frontier. They turned their violence on the family of a settler named Stiegel, and among the victims was a child. This was a community that had had enough. The killing of the Stiegel family lit a fire under the surrounding settlers that no previous atrocity had managed to light, partly because of its sheer cruelty and partly because, by this point, the legend of the Harps had grown into a genuine regional terror that people were desperate to end. A posse was raised, the kind of improvised frontier justice we talked about earlier, and this time it actually worked. They tracked Big Harp down in 1799. What happened next is grim, and it is also the reason a road in Kentucky carries a rather macabre name to this day. Big Harp was caught and killed by the pursuing men, and in an act that reflects just how much rage and fear he had inspired, his head was cut off and mounted on a tree at a crossroads, as a warning to any other killer who might be tempted to follow his example. That spot, and the road that runs through it, became known as Harp's Head Road, a name it still bears, which has to be among the more sinister pieces of historical trivia hiding in plain sight on a modern map. Most roads are named for pleasant things, founders or trees, or the town they lead to. This one is named for the place where they displayed a murderer's severed head, and the locals have apparently made their peace with it, presumably because by now it is simply the road you take to get to the next town. Little Harp, the smaller and slipperier of the two, managed to escape the fate of his partner, at least for a while. He vanished into the criminal underworld of the river country, and for several years he stayed hidden by adopting new names and new associates, drifting among the very gangs that had once found even him too much to handle. But the frontier was filling up. The law was slowly catching up, and the kind of anonymity that had once protected men like the Harps was running out. There is even a story that he tried to claim a reward by turning in the head of a fellow outlaw, only to be recognised himself in the process, which would be a darkly fitting way to be undone. Little Harp was eventually identified, captured, and in 1804 he was hanged, finally closing the book on America's first documented serial killers some 5 or 6 years after their spree began. In a fittingly grim echo of his partner's fate, his head too was reportedly displayed in public, because the early United States, whatever its other shortcomings, did not believe in subtle deterrence. It is worth pausing on why the Harps, specifically, get tagged with the unenviable title of America's first serial killers, because the frontier was hardly short of violent men. The label has a fairly precise modern meaning, describing someone who kills repeatedly over time, driven by an internal compulsion rather than a single clear motive like robbery or revenge, and usually with a cooling-off period between the killings. By that definition, most frontier outlaws do not qualify, because they killed in the course of theft and would happily have skipped the killing if the loot came easily. The Harps fit the pattern almost uncomfortably well. The violence was the goal. It continued across years and across a wide geography, and it followed no rational plan that anyone could detect. They were doing, in the 1790s, the thing we did not even have a name for until well into the 20th century, which is part of why they so thoroughly unnerved the people who hunted them. Their contemporaries reached for words like monster and demon precisely because the vocabulary that might have made sense of them did not yet exist. Over the decades that followed, their story hardened into frontier folklore, the kind of campfire legend parents used to keep children close, and like all good legends it grew in the telling, which is yet another reason the real numbers are so hard to pin down beneath the layers of retelling. What makes the harps worth remembering is not the body count, ghastly as it is, but what they reveal about the moment that produced them. They were not supernatural monsters or one in a billion anomalies. They were a product of a specific time and place, a society being born so quickly and over such a vast and ungoverned space that violence was, for a brutal stretch, simply baked into the foundation. The romantic image of the frontier, all rugged self-reliance and open opportunity, was real enough, but it had a shadow, and the shadow was that the same absence of authority that let an honest family build a new life from nothing also let two men kill dozens of people for years before anyone could stop them. The nation we know was assembled on top of that, and the harps are a reminder that its earliest pages were a great deal darker than the textbooks tend to let on. Now, the harps were bound together by blood, brothers or cousins, and that brings us, by a slightly uncomfortable bridge, to a different kind of story about family ties, one where the danger comes not from what two relatives did together, but from the simple fact that they were related at all, because it turns out that some of the most powerful and celebrated families in all of history quietly destroyed themselves from the inside out, not through war or betrayal, but through the contents of their own DNA. And to understand how that happens, we need to spend just a moment on the biology, because once you grasp the basic mechanism, every story that follows clicks neatly into place. Inside your cells, you carry 2 copies of nearly every gene, one inherited from each parent. Many harmful genetic conditions are what we call recessive, which means they only cause a problem if a person happens to inherit 2 broken copies of the same gene, one from the mother and one from the father. If you inherit 1 broken copy and 1 working copy, the working copy quietly covers for the broken one, and you sail through life with no idea anything is amiss, simply carrying the hidden trait without ever showing it. This is the system working as intended, and it is also why harmful recessive genes can lurk silently in a population for generations. The problem only emerges when 2 people who both happen to carry the same rare broken gene have a child together, because now there is a real chance that child inherits 2 broken copies and develops the condition. In a large, well-mixed population, the odds of 2 carriers of the same rare gene finding each other and having children are pleasingly low. A rare gene is rare precisely because most people do not have it, so the chance that both of a child's parents are hiding the same one is small. But within a family, where everyone shares a common ancestry, those odds skyrocket because relatives are far more likely to carry the same hidden defects inherited from a shared ancestor. Marry your relatives generation after generation, and you're essentially running a lottery where you keep buying more and more tickets for a prize nobody wants. To put a number on it, when 2 carriers of the same recessive condition have a child together, there is roughly a 1 in 4 chance that child inherits 2 broken copies and is affected. A 1 in 2 chance the child becomes a silent carrier like the parents, and a 1 in 4 chance the child dodges the gene entirely. Those are not comforting odds when the same broken gene is circulating through an entire family, and every marriage within that family keeps pulling from the same loaded deck. There is a name for the mechanism that turned a single settler's hidden gene into a defining family trait, and it shows up again and again wherever a small group becomes cut off from the wider world. When a population descends from just a handful of founders, whatever genes those founders happen to carry, common or rare, get amplified far beyond their usual frequency, simply because there are so few other genes in the mix to dilute them. A trait that might appear in one person in tens of thousands across a large nation can become almost ordinary inside a tiny isolated community, not because anything unusual is happening biologically, but because the gene pool is so small that the same cards keep getting dealt. Mountains, oceans, deserts, language, religion, any barrier that keeps a group marrying among itself for long enough will do it. The Kentucky Valley did it by accident of geography. As we're about to see, Europe's grandest dynasty managed to recreate the exact same effect on purpose, inside a palace, by treating the entire continent as off-limits for marriage and the family itself as the only acceptable pool. The first family that puts a literal colour to this idea lived in an isolated pocket of the Kentucky hills, along a creek with the wonderfully ominous name of Troublesome Creek, and they are remembered today as the Blue People of Kentucky. The story begins with a settler named Martin Fugate, who arrived in this remote, hard-to-reach valley in the early 1800s. Fugate, as luck would have it, happened to carry a rare recessive gene for a condition called methemoglobinemia, which affects the blood's ability to carry oxygen in the normal way, and crucially tints the skin a striking shade of blue. On its own, his single copy of the gene did nothing, and he lived an ordinary life. But the valley he settled in was about as cut off from the wider world as a place in America could be. There were no roads worth the name, the terrain was punishing, and the result was a community that, over the generations, married almost entirely among itself, simply because there was hardly anyone else around to marry. When your nearest potential spouse lives several brutal days of travel away, the local options become a great deal more appealing by default. Through one of those quiet coincidences that genetics occasionally arranges, another carrier of the very same rare gene married into the family, and from that point on the broken gene began circulating within a closed population. Generation after generation, as cousins married cousins for the simple practical reason that the next valley was a serious expedition away, the odds kept stacking, until eventually children began to be born who had inherited 2 copies of the gene, and those children were unmistakably and permanently blue. Not a faint tinge, but a genuine vivid blue across the skin, the kind of thing that would stop a stranger in their tracks. For close to 200 years, an isolated family in the Kentucky hills included members who were quite literally blue, an inherited trait passed quietly down the bloodline, largely unremarked upon within a community where it was simply a known family characteristic, like a particular nose or a tendency toward red hair. Within the valley it was unremarkable. It was only to the wider world, when it finally came knocking, that the family seemed extraordinary. The truly satisfying part of this story is its ending, because unlike most of the tales in this chapter, it has one. In the modern era, a doctor finally took a proper scientific interest in the family and worked out exactly what was happening at the chemical level, and the treatment turned out to be almost absurdly simple. A dose of a particular dye called methylene blue, which sounds like it should make the problem worse but in fact corrects the underlying chemistry, was administered, and the effect was close to magical. The blue colour faded away within minutes, and for the first time some members of the family saw their own skin turn an ordinary shade. After 2 centuries of a mystery that had marked a family across generations, the cure was a cheap, fast-acting compound, and a doctor curious enough to ask the right question, which is a rare and welcome happy ending in a subject that mostly specialises in the opposite. For the next example, we leave the quiet Kentucky hills and ascend to the very pinnacle of European power, to a royal house so dominant that for a couple of centuries it effectively ran a large slice of the continent. The Habsburgs were one of the most successful dynasties in history, controlling at various points an astonishing collection of kingdoms and territories, and they achieved much of that success through a strategy that was, on paper, rather clever and in the long run genetically catastrophic. Rather than marry their sons and daughters off to rival families and risk diluting their power or losing territory, the Habsburgs preferred to keep everything in the family by marrying their own relatives again and again across generation after generation. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, and the family tree, instead of branching outward the way a healthy one should, began to fold back in on itself until it more closely resembled a tangled knot than a tree at all. The political logic was sound. Keep the marriages internal and the power stays consolidated and the inheritance never slips away to outsiders. The biological logic, unfortunately, was sending increasingly urgent warnings that nobody in a crown was inclined to read. The most visible result of all this was a physical trait so consistent across the family that it has its own name, the Habsburg jaw. Over the generations, an increasing number of Habsburgs were born with a pronounced protruding lower jaw and a heavy, jutting lower lip, a distinctive facial structure that grew more exaggerated as the inbreeding intensified. You can actually watch it progress through the family's many royal portraits, the jaw growing steadily more prominent down the generations like a feature being slowly turned up by an unseen hand. Court painters, who naturally had a strong professional interest in not offending the people paying them, did their tactful best, but there is only so much flattery can hide, and the Habsburg jaw stares out of those gilded frames with an honesty the painters surely did not intend. It is one of the few cases in history where the propaganda portraits accidentally became medical evidence. All of this accumulated, generation by generation, into a single tragic figure who represents the absolute endpoint of the strategy, a king named Charles II of Spain, who lived from 1661 to 1700. By the time Charles was born, the family tree had folded back on itself so many times that, by some calculations, he was more inbred than the child of a brother and sister would typically be, despite his parents not being siblings, simply because the same ancestors appeared over and over throughout his lineage. He inherited a devastating concentration of genetic problems. The famous jaw was so severe in him that he reportedly could not chew his food properly and had significant difficulty speaking. He suffered from a long list of physical and developmental difficulties, was sickly and frail throughout his life, did not walk until he was well past the age most children manage it, and was unable to father children. The court spent his entire reign anxiously aware that the king's failure to produce an heir was a slow-motion crisis with no obvious solution. So poor was his health, and so limited his ability to rule, that much of the actual governing was done by regents and advisors around him, and the superstitious public, unable to imagine that a king could simply be that unwell by natural causes, settled on the explanation that he must be the victim of witchcraft, earning him the grim nickname of Charles the Bewitched. The real curse, of course, was nothing supernatural at all. It was sitting quietly in his chromosomes, placed there by generations of well-meaning ancestors chasing political advantage. And that final detail is where the centuries of internal marriage delivered their ultimate ironic punchline. The entire strategy had been designed to preserve the dynasty and keep the bloodline pure and powerful, and it succeeded so completely that it produced a king who could not continue the bloodline at all. When Charles died without an heir in 1700, the senior line of the most powerful family in Europe simply stopped, ended not by an enemy army but by its own genetics. The scramble among rival powers to claim the now vacant Spanish throne erupted into a sprawling continental conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession, which dragged in much of Europe and reshaped the balance of power for a generation. So the Habsburgs' obsession with keeping their inheritance in the family ultimately triggered a continent-wide war over who would inherit it. The strategy, in the end, accomplished the precise opposite of its goal, which is the kind of outcome that would be funny if it had not cost so many lives. For the final example, we travel further back than anything else in this story, thousands of years into the ancient world, to a name everyone recognizes and a face millions have seen, the boy king of Egypt, Tutankhamun. The dazzling golden mask and the treasure-crammed tomb have given us an image of a glittering young pharaoh, but the science conducted on his actual remains tells a very different and far more human story, and it is, once again, a story written in the genes by generations of marriage within the family. Egyptian royalty practiced sibling marriage deliberately, viewing it as a way to keep the royal bloodline divine and undiluted, mirroring the relationships they attributed to their own gods. If your gods married their siblings, the reasoning went, then so should the living gods on the throne. Tutankhamun was the product of exactly this. Modern analysis of the royal mummies has concluded that his father, the pharaoh known as Akhenaten, had children with his own sister, and Tutankhamun was the result of that union. The consequences are written all over his body. Far from the robust golden god of the popular imagination, the young pharaoh appears to have been a physically frail individual who struggled with a range of inherited conditions. Examinations of his remains have indicated a cleft palate, a noticeably club foot that would have affected how he walked, and a partial fusion of some of the bones in his spine. Tellingly, his tomb was found to contain a substantial collection of walking sticks, which historians once assumed were purely ceremonial symbols of royal authority, but which, in light of the medical findings, look a great deal more like the practical aids of a young man who genuinely needed help getting around. He was not striding through his palace in golden glory. He was, in all likelihood, leaning on a cane. Studies of his remains have also suggested he suffered repeated bouts of malaria, which a body already weakened by genetic burdens would have been poorly equipped to fight off, and he died young, in his late teens, his reign cut short before it had really begun, and the tomb held one final, quietly heartbreaking detail that ties the whole genetic thread together. Among the treasures, archaeologists discovered two tiny mummified bodies, the remains of two infants, almost certainly Tutankhamun's own children, who had died before or shortly after birth and been laid to rest alongside their father. They are a silent testament to the same forces that shaped his short life, the accumulated genetic burden of a family that had married within itself for too long, leaving even a pharaoh, surrounded by all the gold and power of an empire, unable to produce a surviving heir. The golden mask gets all the attention, but those two small bundles tell the truer story. Stand back and look at these stories together, and a genuinely strange pattern comes into focus. For enormous stretches of human history, the people occupying the most powerful positions on the planet, the kings, the pharaohs, the dynasties that decided the fate of millions, were frequently among the least genetically fortunate individuals alive, precisely because their power was built on keeping the bloodline closed. The very thing they did to protect their status, marrying within the family to hold on to their crowns, was the thing that slowly broke their bodies and, in the most dramatic cases, ended their lines entirely. An isolated family in a Kentucky valley turned blue for the same fundamental reason a Spanish king could not continue his dynasty: the simple, unforgiving mathematics of a family tree that refused to branch. The difference is only that one family had no choice, hemmed in by mountains and distance, while the other did it on purpose, in pursuit of power, and arguably should have known better. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the bloodlines guarded most jealously of all were often the ones quietly engineering their own undoing. We have just spent a while looking at harm that people inherited without any say in the matter, written into them before they were even born. So it makes a certain grim sense to turn now to harm that people went out and cheerfully bought for themselves, over the counter, with a smile, fully convinced it was doing them a world of good. Because there was a stretch of history, not nearly as long ago as you might hope, when one of the most notorious substances on the planet was not only legal, but actively marketed as a health product, something a respectable person might give to their children, recommend to their priest, or sip from a fashionable bottle to perk themselves up before dinner. The drug was cocaine, and for several decades it was treated less like a danger and more like a wonder of modern chemistry. Before we go any further, let me be very clear about what this is and what it is not. This is a history lesson about a genuinely strange chapter of the past, a look at how an entire society got something catastrophically wrong because the science had not caught up with the chemistry. It is absolutely not an endorsement of anything, and the suffering that this substance went on to cause, then and now, is no joke at all. The whole point of the story is how dangerous it is to embrace something powerful before you understand it, and history paid for that lesson in full. With that firmly established, let us travel back to the moment it all began, when a clever bit of laboratory work accidentally opened a door that took the better part of a century to close. The story really starts around 1859 and 1860, when a German chemist named Albert Niemann successfully isolated the active compound from the leaves of the coca plant. Now, the coca leaf itself had been chewed for thousands of years in parts of South America, used mildly for energy and to blunt hunger and fatigue at high altitude, in roughly the way someone today might lean on a strong cup of coffee. That traditional use was a slow, gentle thing. What Niemann had done was something else entirely. He had taken that diffuse, mild plant and concentrated its punch into a pure, potent chemical, which is a bit like the difference between a candle and a flamethrower. The intentions were perfectly scientific and even medical, since the compound turned out to be a genuinely useful local anesthetic, the first that actually worked, a real breakthrough for surgery and dentistry. The trouble was that nobody yet understood the other half of what they were dealing with. It helps to remember that this drug was not some lone offender. It arrived during the golden age of what were called patent medicines, an era when shelves groaned under the weight of bottled cure-alls promising to fix everything from a cough to a broken heart. Most of them a mystery blend of alcohol, opium, and whatever else the maker had lying around. There were no rules requiring a manufacturer to list what was actually in the bottle, so a customer reaching for a soothing syrup had essentially no way of knowing whether they were buying a harmless herbal infusion or a potent narcotic. In that environment, a cocaine tonic did not stand out as alarming. It blended right in with 1,000 other dubious remedies, all of them sold with the same breezy confidence. Even respected members of the medical profession championed the new compound enthusiastically in its early years, publishing glowing accounts of its benefits and recommending it for an astonishing variety of ailments, including, with spectacular misjudgment, as a supposed cure for other addictions. The idea of treating one dependency by handing the patient a different and equally addictive substance is the kind of plan that sounds reasonable only to someone who has not yet seen how the story ends, and unfortunately nobody had. And so, with the boundless enthusiasm of an age that had not yet learned to be suspicious of a miracle, this new compound was immediately stuffed into absolutely everything. It turned up in drops sold for toothache, marketed cheerfully to soothe a child's aching mouth, which is a sentence that should make any modern parent break into a cold sweat. It appeared in lozenges, in powders, in pick-me-up tonics promising to cure exhaustion, melancholy, shyness, and just about any complaint a Victorian customer could name. The prevailing attitude toward a powerful new substance was not let us proceed with caution, but rather let us put it in a syrup and see who buys it. Customer safety testing, as we would understand it, simply did not exist. Their idea of quality control was watching to see if the customers came back, which, given what they were selling, they very reliably did. The undisputed superstar of this entire era, the product that turned cocaine from a curiosity into a craze, was a drink called Vin Mariani, launched around 1863 by a Corsican entrepreneur named Angelo Mariani. The concept was elegant in its simplicity and alarming in its execution. Mariani took wine and steeped coca leaves in it, and the alcohol pulled the compound out of the leaves and into the drink, producing a tonic that carried a meaningful dose of cocaine in every serving. The combination of alcohol and the stimulant created an effect that drinkers found absolutely delightful, and the product became a runaway international sensation. This was not some shady backstreet concoction sold in whispers. Vin Mariani was the height of sophistication, advertised everywhere, sipped by the fashionable, and considered a tonic for the discerning and the refined. What truly cemented its reputation was its astonishing roster of admirers, because Mariani was a marketing genius generations ahead of his time. He pioneered the celebrity endorsement, gathering glowing testimonials from the most famous and respectable people of the age. The drink counted among its devotees royalty, celebrated writers and heads of state, and most jaw-dropping of all, it received an enthusiastic blessing from the very top of the Catholic Church. Pope Leo XIII was reportedly such a fan that he carried a personal flask of the stuff, and even awarded Mariani a medal in gratitude. Let that settle for a moment. The head of the Catholic Church was a paying customer and public booster of a cocaine wine, and saw nothing whatsoever odd about it, because in that moment there was nothing odd about it. The famous adventure novelist Jules Verne was an admirer, and so were various American presidents and European monarchs. When the most powerful and respectable figures on earth are all quietly enjoying the same cocaine tonic and recommending it to their friends, you can perhaps forgive the ordinary public for assuming it must be perfectly fine. It was the spectacular success of Vin Mariani that set in motion the creation of one of the most famous products in the history of the world. Across the Atlantic, an American pharmacist named John Pemberton looked at the runaway popularity of the French coca wine and decided he wanted a piece of that market for himself. He set about creating his own version, his own coca-based tonic, and in 1886 he succeeded. There was, however, a small complication brewing in his home region, namely a growing movement to ban alcohol, which made selling a wine-based product locally rather awkward. So Pemberton adapted. He stripped out the alcohol and replaced it with a sweet syrup combined with carbonated water, and to give his drink its distinctive kick he combined the coca leaf with extract from the cola nut, a natural source of caffeine. He marketed it as a refreshing tonic and a cure for headaches and fatigue, and he named it after its two signature ingredients, the coca and the cola. The drink, of course, was Coca-Cola. Yes, the most recognizable soft drink on the planet, the one stamped on billboards in every country on earth, began its life as a medicinal tonic that contained actual cocaine. In its earliest form, each serving carried a small amount of the drug, and it was sold, like everything else of its kind, as a wholesome refresher that would lift your spirits and ease your aches. For a number of years, this was entirely uncontroversial, simply how things were done, but attitudes were beginning, very slowly, to shift, as the darker consequences of the cocaine craze became harder and harder to ignore. Reports of dependence and ruin were accumulating, and the cheerful assumption that this was a harmless tonic was starting to crack. Under this mounting pressure and changing public mood, the company gradually reduced the cocaine content and finally removed it altogether by around 1903, switching to a spent coca leaf with the active compound stripped out, which is the version that has been sold ever since. The cola nut caffeine stayed, the cocaine quietly departed, and the brand carried on to conquer the world while politely never mentioning its origins at the dinner table. There is one more thread worth pulling from this, because the cocaine craze did not just teach a hard lesson about a single drug. It helped give birth to the entire idea that what goes into the things we consume should be honestly labelled and overseen by someone whose job is to care. The era of selling potent substances in unmarked bottles could not survive contact with its own consequences forever, and the growing scandal around mislabeled and dangerous products fed a broader push for the kind of food and drug oversight we now take completely for granted. The fact that you can today pick up a bottle off a shelf and trust, more or less, that the label tells you what is inside and that someone has checked whether it will harm you is not a natural feature of the universe. It was won slowly and reluctantly, partly in response to exactly the sort of free-for-all that let a cocaine wine become a papal favourite. Progress, as is so often the case, arrived only after the damage made it impossible to ignore. Now the story takes its turn toward the genuinely troubling, because the move away from cocaine was not driven purely by a noble awakening to public health. The way the substance came to be banned in the United States is tangled up with one of the uglier chapters of the era, and it is important to tell it honestly. As anxiety about the drug grew in the early 20th century, the public fear was deliberately stoked and steered using grotesque and entirely false racial myths. Sensational newspaper stories and fear-mongering officials spread baseless and deeply racist claims designed to associate the drug with certain communities and to frighten the public into supporting prohibition. These claims were not science. They were not true. They were propaganda, manufactured to exploit existing prejudice and to manufacture political will, and acknowledging that they happened is part of understanding why the laws took the shape they did. The fear was real, but it was built on a foundation of lies, and those lies would cast a very long shadow. That climate produced the first major federal effort to control these substances, an act passed in 1914 that brought drugs like cocaine under strict regulation and effectively ended the era of buying it freely at the corner pharmacy. On its surface, it was a tax and regulation measure, but in practice it marked the moment cocaine crossed the line from legal tonic ingredient to controlled substance, slamming shut the door that Niemann's laboratory work had opened more than half a century earlier. The age of the cocaine wine and the coca toothache drops was over, packed away as an embarrassing relic of a more naive time. But the substance itself did not vanish, and the story did not end. It went underground, and decades later it came roaring back in a far more devastating form. In the 1980s, a cheap, smokable, intensely potent version of the drug appeared and spread with terrifying speed through American cities, hitting poorer urban communities especially hard. This was the crack epidemic, and it was a genuine catastrophe, tearing through neighborhoods, fueling violence, and devastating countless families. The public and political response was swift, severe, and, as it turned out, profoundly unequal in a way that echoed the racial injustices baked into the drug's earlier history. In 1986, lawmakers passed sweeping legislation, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established harsh mandatory minimum prison sentences. Here is where the injustice becomes stark and, frankly, indefensible. The law created an enormous disparity in punishment between two forms of what is essentially the same drug. Crack cocaine and powder cocaine are chemically almost identical, the crack version simply being a processed smokable form of the powder, yet the law treated them as though they were worlds apart. To trigger the same mandatory sentence, a person needed to be caught with 100 times more powder cocaine than crack cocaine. That ratio, 100 to 1, meant that a tiny amount of crack carried the same crushing prison sentence as a huge quantity of powder. Since crack was cheaper and more common in poorer communities, while powder was associated with wealthier users, the practical effect was that the harshest punishments fell overwhelmingly and disproportionately on the poor and on minority communities, for possessing a less expensive version of the identical chemical. It was a glaring inequity hiding inside a single number. It took an astonishing 24 years to even partially fix this. Only in 2010 did new legislation, the Fair Sentencing Act, finally address the gap, reducing that lopsided ratio from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1. An improvement certainly, and a meaningful one, but pause on what that actually means. The law did not make the punishments equal for the same drug. It merely made them less wildly unequal, settling on a disparity of 18 to 1 as the new, more reasonable figure, which tells you a great deal about how deeply the original injustice had become embedded. For a quarter of a century, the legal system had handed down dramatically different sentences for chemically near identical substances, and untangling even part of that took an act of Congress and decades of advocacy. The whole arc of this story rhymes uncomfortably with the present day. If you want to understand the modern opioid crisis, you can see its ancestor right here. Once again, a powerful and addictive substance was widely promoted as safe and beneficial, this time prescription painkillers marketed with reassurances about their low risk. Once again, the wider public trusted that something sold by respectable institutions and recommended by authorities must be acceptable. And once again, the true cost only became undeniable after the damage was already widespread, and a generation had been caught in the consequences. The specific substance changes from era to era, but the pattern is depressingly consistent. A society embraces a powerful new compound on the strength of confident reassurances, only to spend the following decades reckoning with what it failed to understand at the start. The cocaine wine in the Pope's flask and the painkiller in the modern medicine cabinet are, in a real sense, two verses of the same long and cautionary song. The packaging gets more sophisticated, the marketing more polished, and the reassurances more scientific sounding, but the underlying human error stays remarkably constant. We are forever tempted to trust the promise on the label over the warning we cannot yet see, and we tend to learn the difference the hard way, one generation at a time. If that chapter was about a society that refused to take death seriously enough, the next one is about a society that may have taken it a little too seriously, to the point of building an entire culture, a fashion industry, and a thriving market in specialized hardware around the subject. We are heading to the era of the Victorians, a people so thoroughly preoccupied with mortality that they turned grief into an art form, decorated their homes around it, photographed it, and lived alongside it with an intimacy that the modern world, which prefers to keep death politely out of sight, finds frankly unnerving. To understand why the Victorians were so fixated on death, you first have to understand how relentlessly present it was in their daily lives, and the numbers here are genuinely sobering. Among the working class in particular, childhood was a perilous gamble, and a staggering proportion of children died before they reached the age of 5. Disease, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and crowded living conditions meant that losing a child was not a rare tragedy, but an expected feature of family life, something nearly every household experienced, often more than once. When death visits the nursery that frequently, it changes the entire emotional texture of a society, and it produced coping mechanisms that look strange and even cold to us today, but made a terrible kind of sense at the time. One of the most striking of these was a certain emotional guardedness toward very young children, an almost protective reluctance to fully invest in a small child who might not survive. You can see a trace of this in the clothing of the period. Babies and toddlers of both sexes were commonly dressed in identical white gowns, plain little dresses worn by boys and girls alike, with no attempt to distinguish them. There were practical reasons for this, of course, related to laundering and the simple convenience of interchangeable garments. But it also reflected a stage of life before a child had, in a sense, fully arrived, before they had survived long enough to be assigned the full identity and individuality that came later. The moment a boy was finally moved out of these gowns and dressed for the first time in trousers was a genuine milestone, marked by a ritual known as breeching, which functioned as a kind of celebration that the child had made it through the most dangerous years and could now be welcomed more fully into the family's expectations for his future. It was, in its way, a quiet acknowledgement of how uncertain those early years had been. The scale of the mourning industry that grew up around all this is genuinely hard to overstate. Death became, among everything else it was, a thriving business. Entire shops specialized in nothing but mourning attire, stocking the precise grades of black fabric required at each stage of grief, because the rules really were that specific. A widow was expected to pass through carefully defined phases, beginning with the deepest mourning, swathed in dull black cloth designed to reflect no light and permit no ornament, and only gradually, over a period that could stretch to years, easing into softer half-mourning shades of grey and muted purple as the rawest grief was deemed to have passed. To wear the wrong stage at the wrong time was a genuine social misstep, an etiquette failure that the neighbours would absolutely notice. There was even a fashion for jewellery crafted from the hair of the deceased, lockets and brooches and woven keepsakes incorporating a lock of a loved one's hair, so that a piece of the departed could be carried close and worn in public. To modern sensibilities, this sits somewhere between touching and deeply unsettling, but to the Victorians it was a perfectly natural way to keep the dead near, a tangible memento in an age before you could simply scroll through old photographs on a phone. The undisputed high priestess of Victorian mourning, the woman who set the tone for an entire empire, was Queen Victoria herself. When her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, Victoria was plunged into a grief so profound and so prolonged that it genuinely shaped the culture of her age. She went into mourning and, in a very real sense, never came out of it, wearing black for the remaining 4 decades of her life and withdrawing for long stretches from public view. Her devotion to her dead husband became legendary, with his rooms reportedly kept as though he might return at any moment. And because she was the monarch, the most influential trendsetter in the land, her personal grief became a national fashion. Deep mourning, with its strict codes of black clothing and elaborate etiquette, became the expected response to death across society, an entire industry springing up to supply the black crepe, the jewellery made from the hair of the deceased, and the carefully graded stages of mourning attire that signalled exactly how recently one had lost someone and how close the relation had been. Grief became a performance with rules, and Victoria wrote the script. Perhaps the most haunting artefact of this death-soaked culture, the one that tends to genuinely unsettle modern viewers, is the practice of post-mortem photography. To understand why this was a thing at all, you have to remember the state of the technology. Photography was new, expensive, and astonishingly slow. Capturing an image required the subject to hold perfectly still for a long exposure, sometimes many seconds, and any movement at all during that time would blur the result into a smear. This was a real problem for photographing the living, especially fidgety children, who could rarely manage to stay frozen long enough for a crisp picture. The dead, on the other hand, presented no such difficulty. A deceased person holds remarkably still. For a family that had lost a loved one, particularly a child, and who very often had never been able to afford a photograph while that person was alive, a post-mortem portrait offered something precious and otherwise unobtainable. A single lasting image of the person they had lost, the only one they would ever have. So the deceased would be carefully posed, sometimes dressed in their finest clothes, sometimes arranged to appear as though merely sleeping, and occasionally even positioned among their living relatives for a final family portrait. And here is the eerie detail that gives these images their unforgettable quality. Because the living family members had to hold still for the long exposure and inevitably moved a little, while the deceased could not move at all, it is frequently the dead person who appears as the sharpest, clearest, most perfectly in focus figure in the entire photograph. The living come out slightly soft and blurred, the dead come out crisp and exact, an accidental and deeply poignant inversion produced purely by the limits of the equipment. To us they are unsettling. To the families who commissioned them, they were a treasure, the last and only likeness of someone dearly loved. Surrounding all of this was a thick web of superstitions and rituals governing how a household was supposed to behave when death entered it. Customs followed with great seriousness. When someone died, the clocks in the house would be stopped at the moment of death, both as a mark of respect and out of a belief that failing to do so might invite misfortune. Mirrors throughout the home were covered with cloth, born of a superstition that the soul of the departed, or the souls of the living, might somehow become trapped in the reflection. And when the body was carried out of the house for burial, it was taken out feet first, a practice rooted in the belief that if the body left head first, it might somehow look back and beckon another member of the household to follow it into the grave. To the Victorians, these were not quaint eccentricities but sensible precautions, the proper way to manage a dangerous and sacred threshold, and a household that neglected them was thought to be courting further tragedy. All of this points to a society living cheek by jowl with death. But there was one particular fear bound up in the era that deserves its own spotlight, because it inspired some of the most peculiar and ingenious inventions of the age. It was the fear of being buried alive, a terror with its own clinical name, tapophobia, and in this period it became something close to a mass anxiety. The fear was not entirely irrational either. Medicine of the time was not always reliable at distinguishing genuine death from deep unconsciousness, comas, or certain conditions that could mimic death by slowing the breathing and pulse to nearly undetectable levels. Stories circulated, some true and many exaggerated, of coffins being reopened to reveal signs of a desperate struggle within, and these tales spread through the public imagination like wildfire. The result was a population genuinely worried that they might wake up in the dark underground, sealed inside a box, in what is surely a strong contender for the worst possible way to start your day. Naturally, where there is widespread fear, there is a market, and inventors of the 18th and 19th centuries rose to the occasion with a remarkable array of devices designed to give the prematurely buried a fighting chance. These were the so-called safety coffins, and the genuine patents that survive for them are a testament to just how seriously this fear was taken. Many designs centered on a system that would allow a revived occupant to signal the surface. A cord might be placed in the coffin, connected by a chain or wire running up through the earth to a bell mounted above the grave, so that the slightest movement of the supposedly dead hand would set the bell ringing and summon help. Other designs incorporated breathing tubes, narrow pipes leading from the coffin up to the open air, so that an occupant who awoke would at least not suffocate before rescue arrived. Some featured flags or other visible markers that would spring up to alert a passing caretaker. There were even more elaborate schemes involving ladders and escape hatches, on the optimistic assumption that a person who had just clawed their way back from apparent death would also be in fine shape to climb out of a grave unassisted. For all their ingenuity, there is little reliable evidence that any of these contraptions ever actually rescued a living soul from a premature grave, and they came with a grimly practical flaw. A body that has genuinely died does not stay perfectly still in the way the inventors imagined. The natural processes that follow death produce gases and shifting and movement of their own, which could be more than enough to tug a cord, jostle a mechanism, and set the surface bell merrily ringing over a grave whose occupant was, sadly, in no condition to appreciate the alarm. One can only imagine the heart-stopping terror of a cemetery caretaker sprinting to a freshly ringing bell, shovel in hand, only to dig down and discover a false alarm of the most macabre possible kind. The devices, in other words, were far better at frightening the living than at saving the dead. They were less a practical solution, and more a very elaborate way for an anxious public to feel slightly better about a fear that the medicine of the day could not actually resolve. And this brings us to a piece of folklore that you have almost certainly heard, and that is regrettably completely untrue. It is very commonly claimed that the phrase "saved by the bell" originated from these very grave bells, the idea being that a person mistakenly buried alive who managed to ring the bell was literally saved by it. It is a wonderfully tidy story, and it fits the macabre theme so perfectly that it has been repeated endlessly as fact. Unfortunately, it is a myth. The expression "saved by the bell" actually comes from the world of boxing, referring to a fighter who is in serious trouble and about to lose, only to be rescued when the bell rings to end the round before the knockout can land. It has nothing to do with coffins, graves, or premature burial whatsoever. The grave bells were absolutely real. The patents genuinely exist, and the fear that produced them was sincere, but the catchy phrase belongs to the boxing ring, not the cemetery. It is a perfect example of how a good story will attach itself to a memorable phrase and refuse to let go, regardless of whether the connection ever actually existed. It is no accident that this was also the great age of the ghost story and the Gothic tale of fiction haunted by the dead, by premature burial, by spirits that refused to stay put. A culture this saturated in mortality naturally spilled it into its entertainment, and the period produced some of the most enduring, eerie literature ever written. The same anxieties that wired bells to coffins also filled the era's books with the uneasy dead, because a society thinking constantly about death is a society that tells stories about it around the fire. The fears were not confined to the cemetery. They lived in the popular imagination, in the novels people read by candlelight, and in the comfortable shiver of a frightening tale told on a long winter evening. Taken together, all of it, the mourning that lasted decades, the photographs of the dead held dearer than any other, the clocks stopped and mirrors veiled, the bells wired to coffins against a nightmare scenario, paints a portrait of a society that did not and could not hide from death the way we do today. We have largely pushed dying out of the home and into hospitals, out of daily conversation and into discreet silence. The Victorians had no such luxury. Death was in the nursery, in the parlour, in the family photo album, and in the very fashions people wore on the street. Their elaborate customs and strange inventions were not morbidity for its own sake. They were the rituals of people trying to live with grace and dignity alongside something that visited them constantly, and that they had no power to keep away. The people we just left behind, living so intimately alongside death, had at least the decency to be afraid of it. What is harder to wrap your head around is the same general era cheerfully inviting death in through the front door, sitting it down at the vanity table and applying it to their faces every single morning in the name of looking attractive. Because if there is one thing history proves with grim consistency, it is that human beings will absolutely poison themselves to death if it means looking a little prettier at the next social gathering. The pursuit of beauty has always carried a price, but for a long and alarming stretch of the past, that price was paid in actual heavy metals, radioactive elements, and substances that a modern chemist would handle only while wearing a hazmat suit. This is the story of the lengths people went to in the name of fashion, and the bodies it quietly wrecked along the way. Let us begin with a fashion goal that sounds harmless enough on the surface: the desire to be pale. For much of history, and certainly in this period, a pale complexion was the height of beauty and, more importantly, a status symbol. The logic was straightforward and a little sad. If your skin was pale, it meant you did not have to work outdoors in the sun, which meant you were wealthy enough to spend your days sheltered indoors, which meant you were a person of leisure and breeding. A tan, by contrast, was the mark of a labourer, someone who toiled in fields and markets under the open sky. So pale skin became shorthand for "I do not need to work for a living," and people wanted to broadcast that message as loudly as their complexions could manage. The trouble was that not everyone is naturally pale, and for those who were not, the beauty industry of the day had a solution that was, in hindsight, completely deranged. It is worth noting that this fashion for a dangerous manufactured pallor did not appear out of nowhere in this period. It was the inheritance of a very old tradition, because the well-to-do had been painting themselves an artificial white for centuries before, using equally hazardous concoctions, and powdered faces ghostly with toxic compounds had been a mark of the elite across earlier ages too. The Victorians did not invent the lethal pursuit of paleness. They simply inherited it, refined it, and added a few alarming new techniques of their own. The desire to look untouched by labour and sunlight was a remarkably persistent one, passed down like a family heirloom that happened to be slowly poisoning everyone who held it. The solution was arsenic, and it came in a particularly upsetting form known as arsenic complexion wafers. These were small edible tablets, marketed openly to women, that you were meant to swallow on a regular basis to achieve a fashionably pale and clear complexion. Read that again, because it deserves a moment. These were not creams or powders applied to the skin. They were poison, packaged as a dietary supplement that you put in your mouth and ate deliberately in pursuit of a prettier face. And here is the genuinely sinister part. They actually worked, in the most horrifying way imaginable. Arsenic in small, steady doses interferes with the body's production of red blood cells, and fewer red blood cells means less colour in the skin. So the wafers did indeed make their users paler. They achieved the fashionable look by inducing a low-grade, slow-motion poisoning that drained the colour from the complexion, precisely because it was draining the life from the body. The desired pallor was, quite literally, the early visible symptom of being poisoned, and customers paid good money for the privilege, often without the faintest idea what was actually happening to them. The really cruel twist of the arsenic wafer is the feedback loop it created. As the poison did its work and the user grew paler and more wan, the look was admired and reinforced as beautiful, which encouraged her to keep taking the wafers to maintain it, which deepened the poisoning, which made her paler still. It was a closed loop of slow self-destruction dressed up as a beauty regimen, and the advertising of the day praised these products in glowing terms, promising radiant, flawless skin with no hint of the mechanism behind it. To be fair to the manufacturers, a thorough explanation of the active ingredient would not have made for an especially compelling advertisement. Few slogans sell quite as poorly as achieve that coveted glow through mild, ongoing arsenic poisoning. And the wafers were only the most direct route to an arsenic problem, because the substance was woven into the fabric of daily life to a degree that is hard to believe now. A particularly vivid and fashionable shade of green, beloved for decorating homes and colouring fabrics, was produced using arsenic, and this brilliant green turned up everywhere, in the wallpaper lining people's parlours and nurseries, in artificial flowers, in fabric dyes, even in the colouring of certain sweets and toys. As that wallpaper aged, grew damp, or simply sat in a warm room, it could release arsenic into the air of the home, quietly poisoning the very families who had chosen it for its cheerful, lovely colour. So a fashionable household could be poisoning itself from multiple directions at once. The lady of the house eating arsenic for her complexion, while the walls she sat against exhaled it gently into the room. The Victorians were not casually exposed to arsenic. They were practically marinating in it, and they thought the result was charming. If poisoning yourself from the inside was not enough, the era also offered a generous menu of ways to damage yourself from the outside, and the eyes were a particularly popular target. The fashionable look of the time included large, dark, dramatically dilated pupils, which were considered alluring and gave the eyes a soft, dreamy, slightly otherworldly quality. The pupils naturally dilate when a person is excited or attracted to something, so big dark pupils unconsciously signalled romance and allure, and women wanted that effect on demand. The method they used to achieve it was a plant extract from a species so notoriously toxic that its very name is a warning, the deadly nightshade, known as belladonna. The name itself, belladonna, translates roughly to beautiful woman, a cheerful bit of branding for one of the most poisonous plants in the European countryside. Drops made from this plant were placed directly into the eyes, where the active compound caused the pupils to dilate dramatically, producing exactly the large, dark, captivating gaze that fashion demanded. It worked beautifully in the short term. In the longer term, repeatedly dripping a powerful toxin into your eyes had consequences that range from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely catastrophic. Users experience blurred vision and an inability to focus properly, since the same mechanism that dilates the pupil also paralyzes the eye's ability to adjust. They became painfully sensitive to light, and with prolonged use, the damage could accumulate into permanent vision problems and, in the worst cases, outright blindness. So the fashionable pursuit of an attractive gaze carried a real risk of ending up unable to see the admiring glances you had worked so hard to attract, which is about as ironic a punishment as cosmetics has ever devised. There is a small and telling irony buried in the belladonna story. The very same compound that fashionable women were recklessly dripping into their eyes is, in carefully controlled medical doses, a genuinely useful drug, still used by eye doctors today to deliberately dilate the pupil so they can examine the back of the eye. The difference, as always, is everything. A modern ophthalmologist uses a precise, sterile single dose under professional supervision and then sends you home with a warning that your vision will be blurry for a few hours. The Victorian beauty, by contrast, was self-administering an uncontrolled amount of a poisonous plant extract, day after day, purely for vanity, with no idea of the dose and no concept of the cumulative harm. It is the perfect illustration of how a substance is not simply good or bad. It is the amount, the purpose, and the understanding behind it that decide whether something heals you or slowly takes your sight. The eyes attracted other dubious treatments as well, because a bright, clear, sparkling eye was also prized, and the popular wisdom held that a squeeze of fresh citrus would do the trick. Women would drip lemon juice directly into their eyes, believing it would make them brighter and whiter and give them an appealing sparkle. Anyone who has ever accidentally gotten a bit of lemon in their eye while squeezing one over dinner can attest that the body has a very firm opinion about this, and that opinion is a resounding no. The acidic juice did indeed make the eyes shine, mostly because it irritated them so severely that they watered and reddened slightly, producing a temporary glassy brightness. But repeatedly applying acid to the delicate surface of the eye is, unsurprisingly, terrible for it, and over time this charming beauty hack could erode and damage the cornea, the clear protective layer at the front of the eye, leading to lasting harm. The Victorian approach to eye care, it is fair to say, would not pass a modern safety inspection, or indeed any inspection conducted by a person with functioning eyebrows and a basic instinct for self-preservation. It would be a mistake to picture any of this as shady or hidden. These were not back-alley products bought in shame. The arsenic wafers, the lead powders, the belladonna drops were sold openly in respectable shops, advertised in glossy publications alongside hats and gloves and perfume, and recommended in the beauty columns and etiquette guides that fashionable people treated as gospel. They came in attractive packaging with elegant names and reassuring promises, and they were used by the most refined members of society, the very people others look to as models of taste. That ordinariness is the most unsettling part. Nobody felt they were doing anything reckless. They were simply keeping up appearances, following the advice of trusted sources, and buying the same products everyone else of their station bought. The poison was not lurking in the margins of their world. It was sitting right there on the dressing table, between the hairbrush and the perfume perfectly respectable. Returning to the face, the obsession with pale skin extended well beyond swallowing arsenic, because people also wanted to paint their faces a flawless, even white, and the favourite material for the job was a long-standing and beloved cosmetic disaster, lead. White lead-based makeup had been used for centuries to create a smooth, pale, porcelain finish, applied thickly to cover blemishes and produce that prized doll-like complexion. It was effective at covering the skin, which is precisely the problem, because lead is a potent toxin that the body absorbs readily through the skin and that accumulates steadily over time with devastating effects. Lead poisoning produces a grim catalogue of symptoms, including anemia, which ironically contributes to the very pallor the makeup was meant to fake, along with damage to the nervous system, headaches, and over the long term, serious harm to the brain. And lead created its own vicious cycle, much like the arsenic wafers. Heavy use of lead-based makeup damaged the very skin it was applied to, causing it to deteriorate, discolour, and break out in blemishes. The natural response to damaged skin was, of course, to apply even more makeup to cover the new problems, which meant more lead, which caused more damage, which demanded more makeup. Users found themselves trapped in an escalating spiral, slathering on ever thicker layers of a substance that was actively destroying the skin underneath while poisoning the body that wore it. The beauty standard of flawless white skin thus became self-perpetuating, a problem that fed on its own attempted solution, and an entire class of fashionable people slowly accumulated a heavy metal burden in pursuit of a look that the makeup itself was busy ruining. Lead also crept into other products and paints of the era, but its career as a facial cosmetic stands out as a particularly direct route to poisoning, given that people were applying it to their faces by choice, every day, for years. All of these horrors, the arsenic, the belladonna, the lead, share a certain old-fashioned quality. They were the poisons of a pre-modern world, dangers that had been lurking in cosmetics for generations. But then science marched forward and unlocked something genuinely new, a force so novel and so misunderstood that it produced what may be the single, most reckless beauty craze of all time. Toward the end of the 19th century, a series of discoveries revealed the existence of radioactivity, and with it a set of glowing, mysterious, almost magical new elements, the most famous of which was radium. To the public of the time, radium was nothing short of miraculous. It glowed in the dark with an eerie, beautiful light, all on its own, with no apparent source of energy. It seemed to embody a kind of boundless, mystical vitality, a wondrous gift of modern science that surely must be brimming with health and life. To be fair to the people swept up in this, the enthusiasm was not entirely baseless from where they were standing. Radioactivity was a brand new frontier of science, the discovery of brilliant and celebrated researchers, and it really did seem to break the ordinary rules of nature. Here was a material that produced its own light and its own energy seemingly from nowhere, and at the very same time, doctors were beginning to discover that focused radiation could genuinely destroy certain tumours, which lent the whole field a powerful and not wholly undeserved aura of medical miracle. The public took that genuine medical promise and ran with it in completely the wrong direction, reasoning that if a little radiation in the right place could heal, then surely soaking yourself in it everywhere must be wonderful for you. It is the same flawed logic that assumes if one vitamin is good, then swallowing the entire bottle must be excellent, scaled up to a glowing element that accumulates in your skeleton. The science halo was real, the marketing exploited it shamelessly, and the public, dazzled, drank it down both figuratively and, in the worst cases, quite literally. You can probably already sense where this is heading, and yes, it is exactly as bad as you fear. An entire industry sprang up to put this exciting new substance into absolutely everything. Radium was added to cosmetics, to face creams sold with the promise that they would give the skin a youthful, radiant glow, a word that took on a horribly literal meaning. There were radium-infused beauty products of every description, all marketed with breathless enthusiasm about the rejuvenating power of this magical element. Related radioactive materials found their way into other products as well, including a radioactive substance added to certain toothpastes, sold on the promise of a brighter, whiter smile, presumably one that came with a faint glow of its own. The mania did not stop there. The era produced radioactive face powders, radioactive hair tonics, radioactive suppositories, and water dispensers designed to let you irradiate your own drinking water at home, each sold with the same confident promise of renewed health and youthful energy. There was scarcely a product that some enterprising manufacturer did not try to improve by adding a dash of radioactivity to it, because the word itself had become a magic marketing term, a guarantee of modernity and vigour. The marketing was relentless, and the public was enchanted, and almost nobody understood that they were enthusiastically rubbing a dangerous radioactive material into their faces and brushing it onto their teeth. The single most notorious product of this craze, and the one whose story has become a grim legend, was a patent medicine called Radithor. It was, with a simplicity that is almost impressive, just water that had been infused with radium, sold in small bottles, and marketed as a powerful health tonic that would cure a vast range of ailments and restore vigour and vitality. It was, in essence, radioactive water that you drank, advertised as a wonder cure, and it found a devoted customer in a wealthy and prominent American socialite and athlete named Eben Byers, who became utterly convinced of its restorative powers. Byers did not sip it occasionally. He reportedly drank it in enormous quantities, consuming something on the order of 3 bottles every single day for an extended period, dosing himself with radioactive water with the cheerful confidence of a man who believed he had discovered the fountain of youth. What happened to Eben Byers became one of the most chilling cautionary tales of the age, and it is genuinely difficult reading, so I will describe it with restraint. The radium he was drinking did not invigorate him. Instead, it concentrated in his bones and tissues and slowly, relentlessly destroyed them from within. Over time, the damage to his body, particularly to the bones of his jaw and skull, became catastrophic and irreversible. The deterioration of his jaw was so severe that much of it had to be surgically removed, and his overall condition declined into a state of suffering that the medicine of the day could do nothing to halt. He died in 1932, his death a direct result of the radioactive tonic he had trusted as a health drink. His case was so shocking, and the autopsy findings so disturbing, that it became a pivotal moment in alerting the public and the authorities to the true dangers of these products. A headline of the era summed up the whole tragic absurdity with grim economy, noting that the radium water had worked fine right up until the moment his jaw came off. It was the kind of story that ends a craze. In the wake of his death, regulators began to take the dangers of radioactive consumer products seriously for the first time, cracking down on the wild claims of the tonic sellers and the glowing cosmetics manufacturers. The glowing wonder element was quietly stripped of its reputation as a health aid, and the era of drinking your own radiation came, mercifully, to a close. As with so many of these stories, the rules arrived only after a prominent and very public death made the danger impossible to wave away, which is a recurring and rather depressing feature of how safety regulations tend to come into existence. But the radium tragedies were not confined to wealthy customers, poisoning themselves with novelty tonics. The most heartbreaking chapter belongs to a group of ordinary working women whose story became a landmark in the history of labour rights, and they are remembered as the Radium Girls. In the early decades of the 20th century, the glowing property of radium made it perfect for painting the dials of watches and clocks, so that the numbers and hands would shine in the dark, which was genuinely useful and much in demand. Factories employed large numbers of young women to do this delicate work by hand, painting tiny luminous numbers onto dials with fine brushes using radium-based paint. The technique they were taught had a casual little rhythm to it: lip, dip, and paint, in which the worker would draw the brush between her lips to bring the bristles to a perfect point, dip it in the luminous paint, apply the tiny figures to the dial, and then return the brush to her lips to repoint it for the next stroke, over and over, hundreds of times a day. Each pass between the lips delivered another minuscule dose of radioactive material into her body, and across months and years of steady work, those tiny amounts added up to a quantity that settled into the bones and never left. The companies that employed them assured the women that the material was harmless, even as some of those same companies took protective measures for their own scientists and managers, a detail that turns the whole affair from mere ignorance into something far more damning. The young women, trusting their employers, painted on. Many of them, in the spirit of the times, even thought the glowing paint was fun, dabbing it on their nails, their teeth, and their clothing to glow at parties, having no idea they were adorning themselves with a substance that was accumulating in their bodies and slowly causing terrible harm. Over time, these women began to fall gravely ill. suffering devastating damage to their bones, particularly in the jaw and mouth where the ingested paint had concentrated, along with a host of other severe and ultimately fatal conditions. What makes the Radium Girls' story so historically important is what they did next. Rather than suffer in silence, a number of these women, by then desperately ill, took on their powerful employer in a legal battle to hold the company accountable, fighting against enormous odds and the very real possibility that they would not live to see the outcome. Their courageous fight drew national attention to the dangers of radium and to the broader question of an employer's responsibility for the safety of its workers. Their case became a milestone in the development of labour law and workplace safety regulations, helping to establish the principle that companies have a duty to protect their employees from known hazards and can be held responsible when they fail to do so. The women paid an unimaginable price, but their struggle helped build protections that benefit workers to this day, which is a small and bittersweet redemption woven into an otherwise devastating story. There is one more poison worth examining, and this one has hidden itself so thoroughly in plain sight that you have almost certainly used the phrase it produced without any idea of its grim origin. The expression mad as a hatter is a familiar one, often associated with a certain eccentric character in a famous children's story, but the phrase is older than that book, and it refers to a real and tragic occupational disease. For a long time, the making of fashionable felt hats, which were enormously popular and considered essential to a well-dressed appearance, involved a manufacturing process that used a compound of mercury to treat the animal fur and turn it into smooth, workable felt. The process at the root of it even had a name, a treatment in which the fur was brushed with an orange-tinted mercury solution that helped the fibres mat together into quality felt, a step so central to the craft that the hatters could not avoid it. Day after day in cramped, steamy, poorly aired workrooms, they inhaled the fumes that rose off the treated fur, and the poison crept into them without dramatic warning, building quietly until the symptoms became impossible to ignore. In the towns where hat-making was a major industry, the resulting illness was so common that it earned a grimly affectionate local nickname referring to the characteristic trembling, a name that turned a serious occupational poisoning into a casual piece of regional shorthand, the way every company town eventually names its particular hazard. Mercury is a powerful neurotoxin, and chronic exposure to it produces a distinctive and devastating set of symptoms affecting the nervous system. The symptoms were profound. Sufferers developed severe tremors, an uncontrollable shaking of the hands and body that made fine work increasingly difficult. They experienced dramatic changes in personality and mood, including extreme shyness, irritability, anxiety, and a creeping paranoia. In advanced cases, the mental effects deepened into confusion, hallucinations, and a general unravelling of the mind. To an outside observer, a hatter who had spent years breathing mercury vapour would appear to be losing his sanity, trembling, fearful, withdrawn, and behaving erratically, and so the trade became synonymous with madness. The phrase mad as a hatter was not a whimsical bit of nonsense. It was a plain description of what working with mercury did to the people who made the era's beloved hats, hidden inside an idiom so common we use it without a second thought. What is perhaps most maddening about the hatter's plight is how long it was allowed to continue after the cause was understood. The link between the mercury process and the hatter's suffering was recognised for a very long time before anything meaningful was done about it, partly because the mercury method was cheap and effective, and the alternatives were inconvenient, and partly because the people being harmed were ordinary workers whose suffering carried little weight against the smooth running of a profitable industry. Safer techniques existed, but the trade clung to its toxic shortcut for decades, and the practice of using mercury in hat-making was only truly stamped out well into the 20th century, long after generations of hatters had already paid for it with their health and their minds. It is a sobering reminder that simply knowing the cause of a harm has never by itself been enough to stop it. Someone has to decide that the people being hurt matter more than the convenience of hurting them, and history shows that decision often takes an embarrassingly long time to arrive. There is also an uncomfortable truth threaded through several of these fashions, which is that the dangers were not always entirely hidden. In some cases, whispers of harm circulated, the occasional doctor sounded a warning, and users themselves noticed unpleasant effects: the watering eyes, the headaches, the strange fatigue. And a great many people pressed on regardless, because the social pull of looking fashionable was simply stronger than a vague, deniable fear of distant consequences. The promise of beauty was immediate and visible, here and now at tonight's gathering, while the danger was abstract, gradual, and easy to assume would happen to someone else. That calculation, trading a slow, uncertain harm for an instant social reward, was the quiet engine behind much of the suffering in this chapter. Stand back from the whole grim parade, and a single uncomfortable theme runs through every one of these stories, tying the arsenic eater, the belladonna user, the lead-painted face, the radium drinker, and the trembling hatter together. In each case, the science of the time had advanced just far enough to create something powerful and novel, to isolate a potent chemical, to harness a glowing new element, to industrialize a manufacturing process, but had not advanced nearly far enough to understand the consequences of what it had unleashed. This is the genuinely dangerous middle ground of knowledge, the stretch where a society possesses the capability to do something remarkable, without yet possessing the wisdom to know whether it should. They knew enough to put radium in a bottle, but not enough to know it would dissolve a man's bones. They knew enough to make a flawless white complexion, but not enough to know it was poisoning the brain beneath it. They knew enough to be dangerous, and not yet enough to be safe. It is tempting to look back on all of this with a comfortable sense of superiority, to chuckle at the foolishness of people who ate arsenic for their complexion and drank radioactive water for their health, secure in the knowledge that we would never be so naive. But that comfort deserves a little suspicion, because every one of these crazes was, in its moment, the cutting edge. The arsenic wafer, the radium cream, the mercury hat, all of them were modern, fashionable, science-approved, and embraced by sensible people who trusted that the experts in the marketing knew what they were doing. The people who used these products were not stupid. They were simply living at the front edge of a knowledge that had not finished arriving, trusting in a science that was still finding its footing. And that should give the modern reader a moment of genuine pause, because we too live at the front edge of our own incomplete knowledge, surrounded by products and habits embraced with total confidence, some unknown fraction of which future generations will regard with exactly the same horrified amusement we reserve for the woman calmly dripping deadly nightshade into her eyes to look a little more alluring at the ball. The names will be different and the science will be newer, but the impulse to chase the visible reward today and quietly assume the hidden cost belongs to someone else tomorrow is one of the most durable things about us, and it has never once gone out of fashion. The last chapter showed us a science advanced enough to be dangerous, but not yet wise enough to be safe. This one shows us something arguably more embarrassing, a science that was not so much mistaken as it was actively bending itself into knots to confirm what people already believed. Because for an astonishingly long stretch of history, the medical profession maintained an entire diagnosis, complete with symptoms, treatments, and learned debate, that existed for one fundamental purpose: to explain why women occasionally failed to behave the way men found convenient. The diagnosis was called hysteria, and the story of how it was understood and treated is one of the most absurd and revealing tangles in the whole history of medicine. A case study in how easily science will roll up its sleeves and get to work proving a prejudice. Let us start with the word itself, because the word gives the entire game away before we have even begun. The term hysteria comes directly from the ancient Greek word for the womb. That is the root, that is the origin, and it tells you everything about the assumption baked into the concept from its very first day. A condition was named after the female reproductive organ, because the condition was believed, quite literally, to originate from it, and to be exclusive to the people who possessed one. Right there, encoded in the vocabulary, was the founding idea that whatever was wrong with a woman, the ultimate source of the trouble was simply the fact that she was a woman. It is hard to think of a more efficient piece of circular reasoning. The disease of being female was traced, after careful investigation, to the presence of female anatomy. So what exactly were the symptoms of this mysterious affliction? This is where it becomes genuinely remarkable, because the list of things that could earn a woman the diagnosis of hysteria was so vast and so vague that it functioned less as a medical category and more as a catch-all bin for any behaviour a woman might display that someone, usually a man, found undesirable, inconvenient, or simply puzzling. A woman who fainted might be hysterical. A woman who was anxious or irritable was clearly hysterical. A woman who was too emotional, or not emotional enough, who had trouble sleeping, who felt tired, who felt restless, who expressed strong opinions, who was unhappy in her marriage, who laughed too loudly, or who, heaven forbid, spoke in a manner considered too blunt or coarse for her sex, all of these could be folded neatly under the same diagnosis. The condition was essentially a medical label for a woman who was not behaving as expected, and since expectations for women were narrow and rigid, the diagnosis could be applied to nearly anyone at almost any time. It was, in modern terms, the ultimate one-size-fits-all explanation, and the thing it was actually measuring was not illness but deviation from a very confining ideal. To understand how medicine arrived at such a sweeping idea, we have to trace the concept back through the centuries, because hysteria was not a sudden Victorian invention. Its roots run all the way back to the ancient world, and the earliest version of the theory is so strange that it would be comical if it had not caused so much real harm. The ancient idea was that the womb was not a fixed organ at all, but a kind of restless, mobile creature living inside the body, an organ with a will of its own that could detach from its proper place and wander around the body at will, like a houseguest who refuses to stay in the room you assigned them. This wandering womb, the theory went, would roam about and lodge itself in the wrong place, pressing on other organs and causing all manner of symptoms depending on where it decided to settle. If it drifted upward and pressed near the chest or throat, it might cause a feeling of choking or breathlessness. If it wandered elsewhere, it produced different complaints. The treatment logic that followed from this was every bit as bizarre as the premise, involving attempts to coax the wandering organ back to its proper position, sometimes using pleasant scents near the lower body to lure it back down, and unpleasant ones near the head to drive it away from the top, essentially trying to herd a reproductive organ around the torso using aromatherapy, on the apparent assumption that the womb had both opinions and a sense of smell. There was also a favoured prescription that followed naturally from this theory, and that reveals its real social function with uncomfortable clarity. If the womb was thought to grow restless and troublesome when it was, so to speak, idle and unfulfilled, then the obvious remedy was to keep it occupied, which in practice meant prescribing marriage and pregnancy as a cure. A young woman displaying symptoms was frequently advised that what she truly needed was a husband and children, on the reasoning that a settled domestic and reproductive life would anchor the wandering organ and calm the whole system. Strip away the anatomical theory and look at what was actually being recommended, and you find medicine quietly instructing women that the solution to their distress was to conform more thoroughly to the exact social role expected of them. The treatment for not fitting the mould was, conveniently, to press oneself more firmly into it. It is a remarkable thing to dress up a social expectation as a medical prescription, and the ancient world managed it with a straight face. What makes this ancient blunder especially striking is that it came from the same intellectual tradition that, in other respects, laid the foundations of rational medicine. The careful observers who insisted that diseases had natural causes rather than divine ones, and who pioneered the practice of studying patients systematically. These were not careless thinkers. In matters concerning men's bodies and general illness, they often reasoned with real rigour and made genuine advances. And yet, the moment the subject turned to women, that same disciplined intellect produced the image of a sentient organ migrating around the torso in search of fulfillment. The very minds capable of dismissing superstition elsewhere swallowed it whole here, which is a perfect early demonstration of the pattern that would repeat for millennia. The blind spot was never a lack of intelligence. It was that the assumption about women sat so deep and felt so obviously true that even brilliant observers never thought to question it. An unexamined certainty is a far more stubborn obstacle than simple ignorance. As the centuries rolled on and the ancient world gave way to the medieval one, the explanation for these same troubling female behaviours shifted to match the preoccupations of the age, which were considerably less anatomical and considerably more supernatural. In a period saturated with religious fear, a woman exhibiting strange or socially unacceptable behaviour, the very same fainting, fits, outbursts, and unhappiness that had once been blamed on a roaming organ was now liable to be explained in spiritual terms. Her affliction might be attributed to demonic influence, to possession, to a corrupted soul, or to dealings with dark forces, with all the terrifying consequences that such accusations could bring in that era. The underlying behaviours being observed had not changed at all. What changed was the story society told to explain them, swapping a misbehaving womb for a misbehaving spirit, while the fundamental assumption that a woman acting outside her prescribed role was suffering from some deep internal disorder, carried on unbroken. It is a sobering thought that across these vastly different worldviews, the one constant was the conviction that the problem lay inside the woman herself, rather than in the impossibly narrow box she was expected to fit into. By the time we reached the more scientifically minded centuries leading up to the Victorian era, the supernatural explanation had fallen out of fashion among respectable physicians, and hysteria was reclaimed as a proper medical condition, a recognised disease of the nerves and the female constitution to be diagnosed and treated by doctors rather than priests. This sounds, on the surface, like progress, a return to a medical framing and away from accusations of witchcraft. And in a narrow sense it was, but the diagnosis remained just as vague, just as conveniently elastic, and just as firmly rooted in the assumption that womanhood itself was a kind of fragile, malfunction-prone state requiring constant medical management. The Victorian physician, armed with the prestige of modern science, simply gave the ancient prejudice a fresh coat of clinical respectability. Now a woman's unhappiness or independence was not the work of a demon or a wandering organ, but a recognised nervous ailment, which somehow made it sound more legitimate while changing absolutely nothing about the underlying logic. The condition became extraordinarily common, a fashionable diagnosis handed out freely, until a significant portion of the female population was considered to be suffering from it to one degree or another, which should have been a clue that the problem was with the diagnosis rather than with half of humanity. There was even a distinct class flavour to it. Among the well-to-do, a nervous, delicate constitution became something close to a marker of refinement, a sign of a sensitive and genteel nature, and the swooning, the attacks of what were politely called the vapours, the retiring to a darkened room to recover from the sheer strain of existence, could function almost as a status performance, proof that one was too finely made for the rough business of ordinary life. A labouring woman who felt faint got on with her day because she had no choice. A lady of leisure who felt faint had the time and the social permission to make an event of it, to be diagnosed, attended to, and treated. The same supposed disease that was used to dismiss women's complaints could also, paradoxically, be worn almost as a badge of delicacy, which tells you how thoroughly the whole concept floated free of anything resembling actual medicine. There is a delicious irony lurking in some of the very symptoms that confirmed the diagnosis, because at least a few of them were being actively manufactured by the fashions of the day. Consider the fainting that was treated as such reliable evidence of a delicate, hysteria-prone constitution. Fashionable women of the period were often laced into corsets pulled so tight that they genuinely restricted breathing and compressed the organs, which is an excellent recipe for feeling lightheaded and keeling over at moments of exertion or emotion. So a woman would be squeezed into a garment that made it physically difficult to draw a full breath, and then, when she duly fainted, the fainting was taken as proof of her fragile female nervous system, rather than as the entirely predictable result of being unable to breathe properly. The fashion created the symptom confirmed the diagnosis, and the diagnosis reinforced the idea that women were delicate creatures who needed to be protected, managed, and laced into supportive garments. It was a closed loop of self-fulfilling prophecy, and the fainting couch, that famous piece of furniture positioned ready to catch the swooning lady, was less a medical necessity than a monument to a problem the era was busy creating for itself. The smelling salts waved under her nose to revive her were treating a crisis that her wardrobe had engineered. Now we arrive at the part of the story that is simultaneously the most absurd and the one I must handle with a certain delicacy, because the standard treatment that developed for this condition is where the whole affair tips over from merely misguided into genuinely surreal. According to the account most commonly told about this era, the prescribed remedy for a woman suffering from hysteria was a form of physical therapy administered in the doctor's office. A pelvic massage performed by the physician continued until the patient reached a state of release that the medical literature of the day referred to, with magnificent clinical detachment, as a hysterical paroxysm. The patient would, the theory held, experience a sudden relief of her built-up nervous tension, after which her symptoms were expected to subside, at least until the next appointment. The treatment was considered entirely respectable, a legitimate medical procedure performed by serious professionals, and women would visit their doctors to receive it as a remedy for their diagnosed condition. And here is the detail that elevates the whole thing from peculiar to almost unbelievable, the piece that reveals just how thoroughly the medicine of the day was serving prejudice rather than reality. The physicians performing this treatment did not, by and large, understand or acknowledge what was actually happening. The reason for this collective blind spot was a belief so absurd that it sounds invented, but which the prevailing medical and social attitudes genuinely held. It was widely maintained that women were simply not capable of sexual response in the way men were, that female pleasure of that kind essentially did not exist or was negligible. So when a treatment produced the obvious physical result it produced, the doctors of the era could not categorize it as what it plainly was, because their entire framework insisted that such a thing was not possible for a woman. They were therefore forced to file the outcome under a clinical heading, a paroxysm, a therapeutic crisis, a nervous discharge, anything but the straightforward explanation staring them in the face. The prejudice was so powerful that it overrode the direct evidence of what was happening in their own examination rooms. They had constructed a worldview so committed to denying female sexuality that they could perform the most obvious demonstration of it imaginable, and still walk away, convinced they had merely relieved a nervous complaint. It is one of the purest examples in all of history of a belief system bending reality to fit its assumptions rather than the other way around. I should pause here to be fair to the historical record, because the persona of an honest guide demands it. In recent years, some historians have questioned just how widespread or literal this particular treatment really was, arguing that the popular version of the story may be tidier and more sensational than the messier truth, and that the evidence is more ambiguous than the well-known account suggests. So it is worth holding the most colourful details a little loosely. But whether the treatment was as common and as direct as the famous version claims, or whether it was rarer and more complicated, the core absurdity at the heart of the chapter is not in dispute. The medical establishment did invent and sustain a sprawling womb-based diagnosis to pathologize ordinary female behavior, and it did so while operating under genuinely held beliefs about women that were spectacularly, demonstrably wrong. That much is solidly established, and it is absurd enough on its own without needing any embellishment. Now, performing manual therapy of this kind, appointment after appointment, day after day, turned out to be physically demanding work, and this mundane occupational reality is what supposedly drove the next chapter of the story, because the doctors got tired. More specifically, they reportedly developed sore, aching hands and wrists from the repetitive effort. A thoroughly unglamorous case of what we would today recognize as a repetitive strain injury. Picture the scene with appropriate sympathy. Here was a respected physician, pillar of his community, complaining at the end of a long day not about the moral or intellectual contradictions of his profession, which apparently never troubled him in the slightest, but about the cramping in his fingers. The treatment was in high demand, the patient list was long, and the physical toll on the practitioner was becoming a genuine bottleneck in the smooth operation of the business. The problem, as the doctors saw it, was not that the entire premise of their work was nonsense. The problem was that their hands hurt, and something needed to be done about it. It is worth noting, too, that there was a quiet commercial logic propping the whole thing up. A condition with no clear definition, no objective test, and crucially no permanent cure was, from a purely business perspective, close to ideal. The symptoms could flare up again at any time, which meant patients returned for treatment again and again, a steady stream of appointments that never quite resolved the underlying complaint, because the underlying complaint had been defined so vaguely that it could never truly be declared gone. A doctor was never going to work himself out of a job treating hysteria, because hysteria was, by design, perpetual. None of this means the physicians were consciously running a racket, most surely believed in what they were doing, but the incentives all pointed in the same comfortable direction, toward keeping the diagnosis broad, the treatment ongoing, and the explanation just mysterious enough to require an expert. The solution, naturally, was technology, and this is where the story delivers its most genuinely surprising historical fact, the one that tends to make people sit up and reconsider everything they thought they knew about the timeline of household inventions. To relieve the physical burden on the physician and to perform the treatment more efficiently, mechanical devices were developed to take over the labour that the doctor's weary hands could no longer comfortably sustain. These were medical instruments, designed and marketed for clinical use in the treatment of the diagnosed condition, and they automated the procedure so that the exhausted practitioner no longer had to provide the manual effort himself. And the truly remarkable part is what this means for the history of technology, because in the rush to electrify and mechanize this particular medical task, the resulting device claimed a startling place in the chronology of modern appliances. The fact is this: when the device was electrified, it became one of the very earliest electrical appliances ever created for use by people. arriving on the scene before a whole range of household machines that we now consider far more fundamental and have always assumed came first. It was electrified, and in use years before, the electric vacuum cleaner appeared to liberate people from sweeping, beating the humble vacuum to market by roughly a decade. It also predated the electric iron, that staple of every laundry room. Sit with that for a moment, because it genuinely reorders your mental picture of how technology entered the home. The march of electricity into everyday life, which we tend to imagine progressing through sensible, practical, wholesome devices, lighting first, then tools to ease cooking and cleaning, actually featured this particular medical instrument near the front of the parade, well ahead of the appliances designed to clean your floors and press your shirts. The order in which we electrified our lives was a great deal stranger than the tidy version suggests, and this is one of those facts that, once you know it, you cannot quite forget. The afterlife of these devices is its own small comedy of manners. As electrical appliances became more affordable and began entering ordinary homes, the device migrated out of the doctor's office and into the consumer market, where it was sold through respectable mail-order catalogues and advertised in mainstream publications as a wholesome health and wellness gadget. The marketing was a masterpiece of careful vagueness, promising vitality, relaxation, improved circulation, the easing of aches, and a general glow of well-being, all described in language so wholesome and so studiously unspecific that it could be printed in a family magazine without raising an eyebrow. For a stretch of years, these devices sat comfortably in the catalogues, right alongside toasters and fans and sewing machines, just another modern convenience for the health-conscious household. And then, as cultural awareness gradually caught up with what the device actually was, and the polite fiction became impossible to maintain, it quietly vanished from those respectable pages, slipping out of the mainstream catalogues and out of the wholesome advertising as discreetly as it had arrived. The product did not disappear, of course. It simply lost its medical disguise and could no longer pretend to be a circulation aid, and so polite society stopped discussing it in the same breath as kitchen appliances. The era of this entire framework eventually came to an end, though not because the medical profession suddenly developed a conscience overnight, or experienced a collective flash of insight into its own absurdity. The diagnosis of hysteria simply faded as the broader understanding of the human mind and body advanced, as psychology developed more sophisticated and less prejudiced frameworks, and as the social position of women slowly began to shift. It is worth pausing on the darker power that such a flexible diagnosis handed to the people who wielded it, because a label this elastic was not merely insulting, it was genuinely dangerous. If a woman could be declared medically disordered for being unhappy, opinionated, or simply inconvenient, then the diagnosis could become a tool for controlling and silencing women who stepped out of line. A husband or a father troubled by a wife or daughter who would not behave as expected could find a physician willing to confirm that her defiance was in fact a symptom, and in the worst cases this could lead to a woman being confined or institutionalized on the strength of an accusation that amounted to little more than being difficult. The machinery of medicine meant to heal could be turned into an instrument for enforcing obedience, with the comforting language of treatment laid over what was really an act of control. Not every case went anywhere near such extremes, and most diagnoses were simply careless rather than malicious, but the potential was always there, built into a category that could be stretched to fit almost any woman whose existence someone found troublesome. It is worth lingering on one other treatment that the diagnosis produced, the part that was no joke at all for the women who endured it. For more severe cases, a fashionable remedy emerged that prescribed enforced and total rest, a regimen in which the patient was confined to bed for weeks on end, isolated from family and friends, forbidden from reading, writing, working, or engaging in any stimulating activity whatsoever, and fed a rich diet while being denied virtually all mental or physical exertion. The theory held that the female nervous system was simply overtaxed and needed to be shut down and recharged like an exhausted battery. In practice, for many women, this meant being sentenced to weeks of crushing boredom and forced passivity, cut off from everything that gave their lives meaning, which for an already unhappy or anxious person was frequently not a cure at all, but a slow torment that made things considerably worse. One writer who endured this rest cure was so affected by the experience of being forbidden to use her own mind that she later turned it into a now famous work of fiction, depicting a woman driven to the edge by exactly this kind of enforced idleness, a story that served as a searing protest against treating a thinking person as a delicate object to be switched off. It stands as a powerful reminder that behind the absurdity were real women whose genuine struggles were met not with understanding but with confinement. As genuine medical and psychological knowledge accumulated, the early pioneers of the study of the mind began to reinterpret the symptoms that had been bundled under hysteria, recognizing that many of them were psychological in nature, expressions of real inner distress rather than evidence of a malfunctioning womb. This was an imperfect and often still deeply flawed step, carrying plenty of its own questionable assumptions, but it did begin the crucial work of relocating the source of the trouble from the female anatomy to the human mind and the circumstances acting upon it. The vast, vague, catch-all category began to dissolve, its supposed sufferers gradually understood through more accurate and more humane lenses. The various real conditions that had been carelessly swept under the single label of hysteria, the genuine anxieties, the actual neurological issues, the real unhappiness produced by genuinely oppressive circumstances, came to be recognized for what they were, separately and properly, rather than lumped together as symptoms of being female. The diagnosis was eventually removed from the official catalogues of recognized conditions entirely, retired as the relic it always was, an embarrassing reminder of how long medicine had mistaken a social problem for a biological one. There is a structural reason this nonsense was able to persist for so long, and it is one worth naming plainly. For virtually the entire history we have been discussing, the people defining these conditions, writing the medical texts, performing the examinations, and pronouncing with authority on the female body and mind were almost without exception men. Women were, for the most part, locked out of the medical profession entirely, unable to train as physicians, unable to publish, unable to sit in the rooms where these supposed truths were decided. So the entire edifice of knowledge about women's health was constructed by people who did not inhabit the bodies in question and who had every cultural reason to assume the worst about the people who did. It is not difficult to see how a field built that way might arrive at conclusions so spectacularly off the mark. When half of humanity is studied exclusively by the other half, and the half doing the studying holds all the social power, you do not get objective science. You get the assumptions of the powerful, formalized and given a diagnosis code. This points to the deepest absurdity of all, the one sitting at the very center of the treatment we discussed earlier. The doctors could not recognize the obvious because their framework insisted that women had nothing meaningful to say about their own bodies, that a woman's account of her own experience was less reliable than a male physician's theory about it. Women were the foremost experts on what it was like to be women, and they were precisely the people whose testimony counted for least. Had anyone been willing to simply ask women about their own lives and bodies and believe the answers, a great deal of this elaborate confusion could have been cleared up in an afternoon. But the entire system was built on the premise that the patient's own knowledge was worthless, and the expert's assumption was sovereign, which is a remarkably effective way to remain wrong about something for the better part of 2,000 years. When you step back and look at the entire arc of this story, from the ancient image of a restless organ roaming the body, through the medieval fear of spiritual corruption, to the Victorian clinic with its respectable diagnosis, and its weary doctors and its surprisingly advanced gadgetry, a single thread runs through all of it, and it is not really a story about medicine at all. The ancient physician, the medieval cleric, and the Victorian doctor were all, in their different ways, looking at the same thing, women who did not always conform to the limited role assigned to them, and all of them reached with total confidence for an explanation that located the fault inside the woman rather than questioning the role itself. The vocabulary changed, the theories grew more elaborate, the instruments became more sophisticated, but the underlying impulse stayed remarkably consistent. The conviction that a woman who did not fit must be broken, and that her not fitting was a medical fact to be managed rather than a reasonable human response to be understood. The costume kept changing while the body underneath it stayed exactly the same. What makes the whole saga more than just a parade of historical foolishness is the uncomfortable lesson sitting underneath it, which is how readily the authority of science and medicine can be enlisted to defend exactly the prejudices it ought to be questioning. These were not ignorant people operating in the dark. They were the educated, credentialed, respected experts of their day, and they used all the prestige and apparatus of legitimate medicine to uphold an idea that was, at bottom, simply a bias about how women were supposed to behave. The diagnosis felt scientific because it came with Latin terms and clinical procedures and learned debate, and that scientific veneer made it far harder to challenge than a crude opinion would have been, because who argues with a doctor? That is the genuinely cautionary part. A prejudice wearing a lab coat is far more durable and far more persuasive than a prejudice stated plainly, and history is full of confident expert consensus that later generations recognized as nothing more than the assumptions of the age, polished until they shone like truth. The story of hysteria is funny in the way only something deeply absurd can be, but it leaves behind a question worth sitting with, namely how many of our own confident certainties are simply prejudices that have not yet been handed back their lab coats. We have just seen how the medical authorities of the past could cling to a comfortable wrong idea for centuries, fitting every piece of evidence into a framework that protected their assumptions. The story we turn to now is cut from the same cloth, except this time the stubbornly wrong idea was not about who was sick, but about why, and the cost of getting it wrong was measured in tens of thousands of lives. It is the story of how the greatest city in the world nearly drowned in its own filth, how one quiet doctor worked out the truth and was ignored for years, and how the problem was finally solved not by reason or compassion, but by a smell so monstrous that it physically drove the lawmakers out of their own building. It is, in the end, a story about the precise circumstances under which a society will finally fix a problem, and the answer turns out to be deeply unflattering. To understand the catastrophe, you first have to picture the city it happened to. In the early and middle decades of the 19th century, London was the largest and most powerful city on Earth, the throbbing heart of a global empire, and it was growing at a pace that no city had ever managed before. Millions of people poured in, packing themselves into a sprawl that expanded far faster than anyone had planned for. And here is the crucial problem that all those people created, the unglamorous reality lurking beneath the grand imperial facade. Every single one of those millions of human beings produced waste, every single day, and the city had absolutely no adequate system for dealing with it. The infrastructure was essentially medieval, designed for a town a fraction of the size, and it was being asked to cope with one of the densest concentrations of humanity in history. The result was exactly as unpleasant as you would imagine, and then somewhat worse. The traditional system, such as it was, relied on cesspits, essentially large holding pits dug beneath or beside houses where human waste would collect, to be periodically emptied by labourers who carted the contents away, often to be sold as fertiliser. This arrangement was barely functional even when the city was smaller, and as the population exploded, the cesspits multiplied into the hundreds of thousands and routinely overflowed, seeping into cellars, courtyards, and the very ground people walked on. Whole neighbourhoods, particularly the poorer ones crammed with the most people, existed in a more or less permanent state of saturation with the byproducts of human life. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a constant, inescapable feature of daily existence for a vast portion of the population, and it created precisely the kind of environment in which disease could flourish on an industrial scale. It is worth understanding why this old system, however crude, had limped along for as long as it did, because the answer involves a genuine and now vanished economy of human waste. The labourers who emptied the cesspits, working by night for obvious reasons, collected the waste and sold it onto farms outside the city, where it served as a valuable fertiliser for growing crops. For a long time this created a rough balance. Waste was produced in the city, carted out, and put to productive use in the countryside, and the men who did this unenviable work could make a decent living from it. But as the city ballooned in size, the sheer volume of waste overwhelmed this modest trade entirely. There was simply far more of it than the carts could remove or the farms could absorb, especially as cheaper alternative fertilizers became available and undercut the value of the city's output. The economics that had kept the cesspits at least somewhat in check broke down. The cost of removal rose while the value of the contents fell, and householders increasingly took the cheaper option of simply letting the overflow drain away into the sewers and the river rather than paying to have it carted off. So an old system that had functioned tolerably at a small scale collapsed under the weight of a population it was never built to serve, and the river inherited the difference. Into this already grim situation arrived a piece of technology that everyone agrees was a wonderful improvement, and that nonetheless made the entire crisis dramatically worse, which is one of history's better practical jokes. The flushing toilet was becoming popular among those who could afford it, and as a personal convenience it was marvellous, replacing the chamber pot and the trip to the privy with something clean and modern. But consider what a flushing toilet actually does. It takes waste and a large quantity of water and sends them together down a pipe and out of the house, out of sight and out of mind. The trouble was that all of that newly liberated waste and water had to go somewhere, and where it went was into the existing cesspits, which were now being flooded with far more liquid than they had ever been designed to hold. The cesspits overflowed faster and more comprehensively than ever, and the overflow drained into the old gutters and channels that had been built to carry away rainwater, and those channels emptied with grim inevitability directly into the river. So the great modern convenience effectively connected every fashionable household's waste pipe to the River Thames, turning the city's central waterway into an open sewer of staggering proportions. The toilet did not create the filth. It simply gave it a fast, efficient highway straight into the river that ran through the middle of everything. And here is where the river problem becomes a death problem, because that same river was, unbelievably, a major source of the city's drinking water. Several private water companies drew their supply directly from the Thames and piped it into homes for people to drink, cook with and wash in. So the population was, in effect, drinking water drawn from the very same river into which the city's waste was being poured. Stated that boldly, it sounds like something no civilization could possibly have allowed to happen. And yet it happened, persistently, for years, because nobody in a position of authority understood that this was the mechanism killing them. They could see the filthy river, they could certainly smell it. But the connection between the contaminated water going into people's bodies and the disease coming out of them was the one link they could not, or would not, make. There were, to be fair, some half-hearted gestures toward improving the water, before the full disaster forced a reckoning. At one point legislation was passed requiring the water companies to filter their supply and to move their intake points further up the river, above the worst of the city's filth, on the dawning suspicion that drawing drinking water from the dirtiest stretch of an open sewer was perhaps not ideal. These were genuine improvements as far as they went, and they hint that at least some people sensed the water was part of the problem, even without fully grasping the mechanism. But the measures were partial, unevenly enforced, and crucially not universal, so while some Londoners ended up drinking comparatively cleaner water, others continued to receive supply drawn from the most contaminated parts of the river. As we'll see, that patchwork of clean and dirty supply, far from being merely a missed opportunity, would accidentally hand a meticulous doctor the single most powerful piece of evidence in the entire affair. The disease in question was cholera, and it arrived in a series of devastating waves that tore through the city. Major epidemics struck in the early 1830s, again at the end of the 1840s, and again in the mid-1850s, each one killing people on a horrifying scale, with the death tolls across these outbreaks running into the tens of thousands. Cholera is a brutal and frighteningly fast illness, capable of taking a person from apparent health to death within a single day through catastrophic fluid loss, and the speed and severity of it spread terror through the population every time it returned. People watched neighbours and family members fall ill in the morning and be gone by nightfall, and they had no idea why, no idea how to protect themselves, and no reliable defence. Each wave left the city traumatised and desperate for an explanation, and the explanation the authorities offered was confident, official, and completely wrong. It did not help that the medicine of the day was essentially powerless against the disease. Lacking any real understanding of what cholera was or how it killed, doctors fell back on the standard interventions of the era, which ranged from the merely useless to the actively harmful. Patients were bled, purged, and dosed with various potions, treatments that did nothing to address the catastrophic fluid loss that was the actual mechanism of death, and that, in some cases, hurried it along. The genuinely effective response, which we now understand to be the rapid replacement of lost fluids and salts, was not part of the toolkit, and so a person who fell ill was largely at the mercy of the disease, while well-meaning physicians applied remedies that could not possibly work. The terror this produced is hard to overstate. A healthy adult could sit down to breakfast feeling perfectly well and be dead before the next morning, and no one could say why, who would be next, or what on earth to do about it. The prevailing theory of the time, embraced by the medical establishment and the government alike, was the miasma theory, the belief that diseases like cholera were caused by bad air, by foul-smelling vapours rising from rotting matter and filth. According to this idea, it was the stench itself, the noxious quality of the polluted atmosphere, that carried sickness into the body. You breathed in the bad air, and you got sick. On the surface, this had a certain intuitive appeal, because the places that smelled the worst, the overcrowded, waste-saturated poor districts, were indeed the places where disease struck hardest, so the correlation between bad smells and bad health seemed obvious. The fatal flaw, of course, was that the authorities had mistaken correlation for causation. The smelly districts were not sick because they smelled. They were sick and smelly for the same underlying reason, namely that they were drowning in waste that was contaminating their water. The smell was a symptom of the real problem, not the cause of the disease, but the miasma theory pointed everyone's attention firmly at the nose and away from the drinking glass. The miasma theory was not merely useless, it was actively counterproductive, because it led the authorities to pursue a solution that made things worse. Reasoning that the dangerous bad air came from the overflowing cesspits, officials encouraged people to empty those cesspits and flush the waste away into the sewers and drains, which, as we have established, carried it straight into the Thames, which was the source of the drinking water. So the official public health policy, derived logically from a completely mistaken theory, was to take the waste and deliver it more efficiently into the water supply, accelerating the very contamination that was killing people. It is a perfect and tragic illustration of how a wrong idea, pursued with energy and good intentions, can be far more destructive than simple inaction. They were working hard, spending money, and taking decisive action, all of it in precisely the wrong direction. Against this tide of confident error stood one man whose work would eventually be recognized as a founding moment of modern epidemiology, though recognition came slowly and largely after the fact. He was a physician named John Snow, a careful, methodical, observant doctor who simply did not believe the miasma theory fit the evidence. Snow had noticed things that the bad air explanation could not account for. He observed that cholera attacked the digestive system, which seemed strange for a disease supposedly entering through the lungs as breathed-in vapour. He noticed patterns in who got sick and who did not, that seemed to track not with the air people breathed but with the water they drank. And so, working against the entire weight of official opinion, he developed the radical hypothesis that cholera was not airborne at all but waterborne, transmitted through water that had been contaminated with the waste of the infected. It was the correct answer, and almost nobody wanted to hear it. What made Snow extraordinary was not just his theory, but how he set out to prove it, because he approached the problem like a detective rather than a man defending a belief. During the outbreak of the mid-1850s, a particularly severe and concentrated cluster of cholera deaths erupted in a specific neighbourhood, with people dying in alarming numbers within a tight geographic area over a matter of days. Snow went into the streets and did the painstaking work that nobody else was doing. He mapped the deaths. He went house to house, recording exactly where each victim had lived, and he plotted these deaths onto a map of the district, building a visual picture of the outbreak. And as the map filled in, a pattern emerged with striking clarity. The deaths clustered tightly around one particular public water pump on a street called Broad Street, from which the surrounding residents drew their drinking water. The further a household was from that specific pump, and the more likely they were to use a different water source, the less likely they were to have died. The pump sat at the dead centre of the catastrophe. Snow even tracked down the apparent exceptions, the cases that at first seemed to break his pattern, and found that they confirmed it. There were people who had died of cholera who lived far from the Broad Street pump, which initially looked like a problem for his theory, until he investigated and discovered that those individuals had, for one reason or another, made a point of fetching their water from that very pump because they preferred its taste, travelling out of their way to drink from the source that was killing the neighbourhood. There were also clusters of people right beside the pump who did not get sick, such as the workers at a local brewery, and Snow discovered that they had their own private water supply and tended to drink the beer they produced rather than the local water, sparing them from the contamination. Every apparent exception, once examined, slotted neatly into place and pointed back at the same conclusion. The water from that pump was the source of the outbreak. The street map of the stricken neighbourhood is the part of Snow's work everyone remembers, but he carried out another study that was, in its own quiet way, even more devastating to the bad air theory, and it relied precisely on that patchwork of clean and dirty water supply mentioned earlier. Snow realised that across large parts of the city, two different water companies served customers who were otherwise all mixed together on the same streets, in the same kinds of houses, breathing the same air. One company drew its water from a relatively clean stretch of the river, while the other still drew from a section thoroughly contaminated with the city's waste. If the miasma theory were correct and bad air caused cholera, then households served by the two companies, living side by side in the same atmosphere, should have suffered roughly equally. If snow were correct and the water was the culprit, then the customers of the dirty water company should be dying at a far higher rate than their neighbours served by the cleaner supply, despite breathing identical air. Snow undertook the grinding work of tracing which homes were served by which company, and tallying the cholera deaths in each, a vast natural experiment laid out across the city. The results were stark and lopsided. Households drinking the contaminated water died at dramatically higher rates than their neighbours drinking the cleaner supply, even though everything else about their circumstances, including the air they breathed, was essentially the same. It was as clean a demonstration as one could hope for, isolating water as the variable that mattered while holding the supposedly guilty air constant. And it too was largely ignored. Armed with this evidence, Snow took his findings to the local authorities and made a request that has become legendary in the history of public health for its elegant simplicity. He asked them to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump so that people could no longer draw water from it. The officials, who did not share his theory and likely regarded him as a crank pursuing an eccentric notion, were sceptical, but they eventually agreed to remove the pump handle, more to placate him than out of any real conviction, and the outbreak in the area subsided. Now, to be scrupulously honest, the outbreak was already declining by the time the handle came off, partly because many residents had fled the stricken neighbourhood, so the removal of the handle was not the single dramatic moment of salvation that the popular retelling sometimes suggests. But the underlying detective work was sound, the conclusion was correct, and the act of removing that handle became the enduring symbol of the whole achievement. The moment a man armed with nothing but careful observation and a map struck a blow against a disease that the entire establishment had completely misdiagnosed. You might expect that this brilliant piece of investigation, this clear and well-evidenced demonstration of how cholera actually spread, would have been seized upon, celebrated, and immediately acted upon by grateful authorities eager to save lives. You would be expecting too much of human institutions. Instead, Snow's findings were largely brushed aside. The miasma theory was deeply entrenched, supported by powerful and respected figures, and woven into the official approach to public health. The idea that something as fundamental as the cause of a deadly epidemic had been worked out by one doctor with a street map, contradicting the consensus of the entire profession, was not a welcome message. Snow's waterborne theory was acknowledged in some quarters but never properly embraced during the most critical years, and the man himself died before his work received the full recognition it deserved. The truth had been found, laid out clearly, and then politely shelved because it was inconvenient and because the people in charge preferred the explanation they already had. The water kept flowing, the river kept filling with waste, and the city remained one hot summer away from disaster. That hot summer arrived in 1858, and it delivered the one argument that decades of scientific evidence and tens of thousands of deaths had failed to deliver, an argument that the lawmakers could not ignore because it assaulted them personally. The weather that summer turned unusually brutally hot, and the heat had a dramatic effect on the river. With little rain, the level of the Thames dropped, exposing the vast accumulations of waste that had been building up along its banks and bed for years, decades, in truth centuries of the city's filth, all of it now baking in the relentless sun. The result was an odour of such monstrous, overpowering intensity that it became known to history as the Great Stink. The smell rising off the river was not merely unpleasant, it was a physical assault, a thick, gagging, nauseating presence that hung over the heart of the city and made life near the water genuinely difficult to bear. And here is where geography delivered its perfect poetic justice, because the seat of government, the very building where the lawmakers of the empire conducted their business, sat directly on the bank of the Thames. The members of Parliament, the powerful men who had for years presided over the slow poisoning of their own population while doing nothing meaningful about the state of the river, suddenly found themselves unable to escape the consequences. The great stink poured in through the windows of their grand chamber and made it nearly impossible to work. There are accounts of the curtains of the building being soaked in chemicals in a desperate attempt to mask the smell, and of members fleeing the riverside rooms with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, retching at the air. The problem they had ignored for so long because it mainly afflicted the poor in their distant smelly districts had now arrived, in overwhelming force, in the noses of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the country. And funnily enough, The political will to act materialised with remarkable speed. The transformation in urgency was almost comical in its abruptness. For decades, proposals to address the city's waste and water had languished, debated endlessly, blocked by arguments over cost and responsibility, deferred and watered down and shelved. Expert commissions had been convened to study the problem, had produced detailed reports diagnosing exactly what was wrong, and had seen their recommendations gather dust, while officials squabbled over who should pay and which authority held responsibility. Grand engineering schemes had been proposed and rejected as too expensive, too disruptive, too ambitious. The plain fact was that everyone agreed the river was a disgrace and a danger, and nobody could be moved to actually spend the enormous sum required to fix it, because the cost was certain and immediate while the benefit was diffuse and fell mostly on people who did not matter to those holding the purse. Then the smell reached the legislators' own desks, and the entire logjam dissolved practically overnight. A bill to fund a comprehensive solution to the city's sewage crisis was rushed through the legislative process at a pace that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, passing in a matter of around 18 days, a genuinely astonishing speed for a major piece of infrastructure legislation, then or now. The government committed an enormous sum of money, on the order of £3 million, a colossal figure for the era, to finally build the city the proper sewer system it had needed for generations. Nothing concentrates the legislative mind quite like the inability to breathe in one's own chamber. The man entrusted with actually solving the problem was a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, and what he went on to build stands as one of the great engineering achievements of the age and a quiet monument to the value of doing a job properly. Bazalgette designed and oversaw the construction of an entirely new sewer system for London, a vast and intricate network engineered to intercept the waste before it reached the central river and carry it far downstream, away from the city and its water supply, where it could be discharged on the outgoing tide and swept out to sea. The scale of the undertaking was immense, involving well over 1,000 miles of underground tunnels and pipes, enormous intercepting sewers running parallel to the river, grand pumping stations to lift the flow where gravity alone would not carry it, and the construction of new embankments along the Thames itself, which both housed major sewer lines and reshaped the very face of the city's waterfront. It was a project of breathtaking ambition, and it was executed with a thoroughness that bordered on the visionary. There is one detail about Bazalgette's work that deserves particular admiration, because it reveals a quality of foresight that is depressingly rare in public projects of any era. When he calculated the size the sewer pipes would need to be in order to serve the population of London, he arrived at a figure based on the number of people the city then held. And then he did something extraordinary. He took that diameter and effectively doubled it, building the pipes far larger than the current need demanded, on the simple reasoning that the city was growing and that you only get one chance to dig up an entire metropolis and lay its sewers, so you might as well build for the future you cannot yet see. This decision, dismissed by some at the time as wasteful overbuilding, proved to be a stroke of genius. The population of London grew enormously in the decades and the century that followed, far beyond what anyone in his day anticipated, and Bazalgette's generously oversized system absorbed that growth and kept functioning. His sewers, built in the middle of the 19th century, remain a core part of London's infrastructure to this very day, still carrying the waste of a city many times larger than the one he built them for. Every modern Londoner who flushes a toilet without a second thought is relying in part on the foresight of an engineer who decided to build twice as big as he needed to, more than a century and a half ago. Bazalgette's project reshaped the city above ground as much as below it, in ways Londoners still benefit from without realising the origin. To carry the great intercepting sewers along the course of the river, he constructed massive new embankments, walling in and narrowing the Thames and reclaiming substantial stretches of land from the water along the way. These embankments did far more than hide a sewer. The newly created ground was used to lay out broad riverside roads that eased the city's notorious traffic, and beneath them ran space that would help accommodate the expanding underground railway. So a single sewage project quietly delivered a new waterfront, new thoroughfares, and room for mass transit, all bundled together. The pumping stations that lifted the flow where the land was too low for gravity to do the work were built not as grim utilitarian sheds, but as grand, ornate structures, decorated with a craftsmanship that treated the unglamorous business of moving waste as something worthy of architectural pride. There is a certain magnificent confidence in building a cathedral to sewage, and the Victorians, whatever their other failings, did not do things by halves once they finally committed. The results of all this effort were as dramatic as the crisis that had prompted it. Once Bazalgette's system was operating and the waste was no longer pouring into the stretch of river from which the city drew its water, cholera, which had returned again and again to slaughter the population every few years, simply stopped. The great epidemics that had defined a generation of London life vanished, not because anyone had set out specifically to cure cholera, but because the engineering had, almost as a side effect, severed the connection between the city's waste and its drinking water that John Snow had identified years earlier. The miasma theorists had got the mechanism completely wrong, but the massive clean-up they had backed for the wrong reasons happened to fix the right problem, and the disease that had terrorized the city for decades receded into history. The water was clean, the river slowly recovered, and the deadly cycle was broken at last. The wider legacy of the whole episode reached well beyond one city's plumbing. The great stink and the clean-up that followed marked a turning point in how societies thought about public health, helping to establish the radical notion that a government bears responsibility for the basic sanitary conditions of the people it governs, that clean water and the safe removal of waste are not luxuries but the foundation on which a healthy population rests. The detective methods the ignored doctor had pioneered, the mapping, the careful tracing of cases, the comparison of populations to isolate a cause, became cornerstones of the science of tracking disease, methods still used to chase outbreaks to this day. And within a couple of decades, the discovery of the actual microscopic organisms responsible for diseases like cholera would vindicate his waterborne theory completely and bury the bad air explanation for good, confirming that the man with the street map had been right all along, while the confident establishment had been wrong. He simply had the misfortune of being correct before the world was ready to believe him, which is a peculiarly common fate for people who turn out to be right. When you lay the whole story out, from the overflowing cesspits to the poisoned river, to the ignored doctor, to the smell that finally forced the issue, a rather uncomfortable moral emerges, and it is worth stating plainly, because it has not exactly stopped being relevant. The evidence for the real cause of the cholera epidemics had existed for years. A careful doctor had laid it out with a clarity that history would vindicate completely, and he had been brushed aside. Tens of thousands of people had died, and their deaths had not been enough to spur decisive action, because those deaths were concentrated among the poor and the powerless, in districts the decision-makers rarely had to visit or think about. What finally moved the machinery of government was not the science, not the mounting body count, not compassion for the suffering, but the moment the problem became physically intolerable to the powerful themselves. The instant the lawmakers could not breathe, the impossible became urgent, the unaffordable became funded, and the project that had been blocked for a generation was approved in under 3 weeks. Progress, in this case, did not arrive on the wings of reason or mercy. It arrived because the stench finally climbed the steps of power and sat down in the chamber, and only then, holding their noses, did the people in charge finally decide to act. The last chapter turned on an invisible culprit, a danger nobody could see lurking in the water, misunderstood for decades because the truth was too small to spot with the naked eye. That theme, the unseen force shaping human events from below the threshold of sight, runs through some of the most dramatic episodes in all of history, because for most of our existence the deadliest enemies our species ever faced were ones we could not see, could not name, and could not fight. But before we get to the microscopic killers that reshape civilizations, we need to start with something stranger, an outbreak that spread not through water or air, but through the human mind itself, a catastrophe with no germ involved at all, in which the affliction was the behaviour. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, one of the most genuinely bizarre events ever reliably documented began with a single woman. A resident remembered as Frau Trophea stepped out into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no apparent reason. She simply started dancing, and then she did not stop. She danced through the day and into the night, and when exhaustion finally dropped her into sleep, she rose and danced again the next morning, and the morning after that. This was not joyful dancing. By every account, it was a grim, compulsive, almost tormented movement that she seemed unable to control, as though her body had been hijacked by something she could not switch off. And then the truly unsettling part happened. other people began to join her. Within days, dozens of people had taken up the same uncontrollable dancing, and within weeks the number had swelled into the hundreds. The streets of the city filled with people dancing relentlessly, helplessly, for hours and days on end, driven by something none of them could explain or stop. This was not a party that got out of hand. The dancers were not enjoying themselves. They moved with a desperate, exhausted compulsion, many of them clearly suffering, some weeping and crying out even as their limbs kept going. And because the human body is simply not built to dance continuously for days, the consequences turned deadly. People danced until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion, and a number of them reportedly died, their bodies giving out from the relentless physical strain of an activity they could not cease. An entire city found itself in the grip of a lethal compulsion to dance, and nobody had the slightest idea what to do about it. The response of the authorities, in one of history's better examples of treating a problem by doing the exact opposite of what would help, was to conclude that the afflicted simply needed to dance the malady out of their systems. So they cleared spaces for the dancers, brought in musicians to accompany them, and even hired professional dancers to keep them company, on the theory that if the sufferers just danced enough, the urge would eventually exhaust itself and pass. The result was entirely predictable to anyone but a 16th century city official. Encouraging the dancing made it worse, providing music and space and encouragement to people who were already dancing themselves to death, which is roughly the medical equivalent of treating a drowning man by adding more water. Eventually the outbreak subsided on its own, as mysteriously as it had begun, leaving behind a thoroughly baffled population and one of the strangest entries in the historical record. So what on earth actually happened? Historians and scientists have proposed a few explanations, and the honest answer is that we still cannot be entirely certain, which is part of what makes the episode so haunting. One theory points to a poison. A particular fungus that grows on rye and other grains, especially in damp conditions, produces toxic compounds capable of causing convulsions, spasms, hallucinations, and a feeling of burning in the limbs. If the city's grain supply had been contaminated and people had eaten bread made from it, the resulting poisoning might explain some of the strange physical symptoms. The difficulty with this explanation is that the toxin tends to constrict blood flow to the limbs in a way that would make sustained, coordinated dancing extremely difficult rather than compelling it. So while it may have contributed something, it struggles to account for the specific behaviour of prolonged dancing. The explanation that most experts now favour is something altogether more unsettling, because it locates the cause not in the body but in the mind, and in the contagious nature of extreme stress. The idea is that this was an instance of mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon in which genuine physical symptoms spread rapidly through a group of people via psychological means rather than any physical agent, fueled by intense shared anxiety. The Strasbourg of that year was a place under enormous strain, suffering from famine, disease, and grinding hardship, with a population pushed to the edge of desperation and steeped in religious fears about divine punishment and curses. Under such extreme and sustained psychological pressure, the theory holds, a kind of collective breakdown became possible, in which one person's affliction could trigger a cascade through a population primed by terror and suggestion, each new dancer reinforcing the reality of the phenomenon for everyone watching. It is a genuinely disturbing thought that the human mind under enough pressure can produce real, physical, even fatal symptoms, and spread them through a crowd like a fever, with no microbe involved at all. The body can be driven to destruction by nothing more than a shared idea, which is in some ways scarier than any germ. What lifts this episode out of the realm of a one-off curiosity is that it was not, in fact, entirely unique. The records of the period contain accounts of other similar outbreaks of compulsive dancing in various towns across the same broad region in the centuries surrounding it, smaller in scale but unsettlingly alike in character. This recurrence is part of why the mass psychogenic explanation carries such weight, because a phenomenon that crops up repeatedly in populations under similar conditions of hardship, fear, and rigid religious dread looks far less like a random fluke, and far more like a predictable, if rare, response of the human mind to unbearable collective stress. The dancing plague was the most dramatic and best documented instance, but it appears to have been one example of a broader and deeply strange capacity of human communities to fall, together, into the same involuntary behaviour. That brings us to the germs themselves, the actual microscopic agents that have, by any measure, shaped human history more profoundly than any king, war, or invention, and the undisputed heavyweight of historical catastrophe, the pandemic against which all others are measured, struck Europe in the middle of the 14th century. The Black Death swept across the continent between roughly 1347 and 1351, and the scale of the mortality it inflicted is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Estimates vary, but the disease is thought to have killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe, with some regions losing even more in the space of just a few years. Try to sit with that proportion for a moment. Picture your own town, your own street, and imagine that within a few years something between a third and half of everyone you know is simply gone. Entire villages were wiped out completely. The social, economic, and psychological fabric of the continent was torn apart on a scale that has no real parallel. Part of what made the Black Death so unstoppable was the very thing that had made the medieval world increasingly prosperous, namely trade. The disease is generally thought to have travelled along the busy commercial routes of the age, carried over land and sea by the constant movement of merchants and goods, hitching a ride with the rats and fleas that infested ships and cargo and warehouses. The same networks that brought silk and spices and grain from one corner of the world to another also delivered the contagion with brutal efficiency, spreading it from port to port and town to town faster than any warning could travel ahead of it. There is a grim irony in the fact that the interconnectedness which enriched the medieval world was also precisely what allowed a single catastrophic outbreak to engulf an entire continent, a lesson about the double edge of connection that would echo through every pandemic that followed. The people living through it had no understanding of what was actually killing them, no concept of the microscopic organism responsible, or the means by which it spread, and so, much like the cholera authorities we have already met, they reached for the explanations available to them. They blamed bad air, divine wrath, planetary alignments, and, in some of the darkest episodes of the period, they turned on scapegoats among their own neighbours, persecuting minority communities in a desperate and tragic search for someone to hold responsible for an incomprehensible horror. None of these explanations was correct, and none of the responses based on them could do anything to stop the dying. People simply endured the catastrophe and survived it or did not, largely at the mercy of chance. But here is where the story takes a genuinely fascinating turn, because the staggering death toll, horrific as it was, set in motion changes that reshape society in ways that historians still debate, and some of them point in a surprising direction. With so much of the population gone, the survivors found themselves in a radically altered world, and one of the most immediate consequences was a sudden and severe shortage of labour. Before the catastrophe, workers had been plentiful and therefore cheap and easily replaced with little bargaining power. Afterward, with so many hands lost, the workers who remained were suddenly in enormous demand, and the basic economics of the situation shifted dramatically in their favour. Those who survived could command better wages and better conditions, because there was simply not enough of them to go around, and their labour had become precious. The rigid old social order, which had kept the labouring population firmly in its place, found itself under pressures it had never faced before, and the long-term loosening of those bonds is something many historians trace in part to this brutal reshuffling. There is an argument, and it is a compelling one, that this very scarcity of human labour helped nudge society toward finding other ways to get work done, toward valuing labour-saving methods and tools more highly, precisely because labour itself had become so expensive and scarce. When people are cheap, there is little incentive to invent machines to replace them. When people become scarce and costly, the incentive to mechanise and to find clever ways of doing more with fewer hands grows considerably. It would be far too simple to claim that a single pandemic directly caused the later transformation of the world through machinery, and no serious historian would put it so crudely. But the idea that the appalling mortality of the 14th century helped tilt the long arc of development toward valuing efficiency and mechanical solutions is a genuinely thought-provoking one. The most devastating disaster in European history may have planted in the wreckage it left behind some of the seeds of the mechanized world that would eventually follow, which is a deeply strange thing to contemplate. Moving forward several centuries to an age that thought itself thoroughly modern, we come to a pandemic that delivered one of the most chilling and counterintuitive lessons in the history of disease. In 1918, as the world was already reeling from the devastation of a global war, an influenza pandemic swept across the planet with terrifying speed and reach. Often called the Spanish flu, though it did not originate in Spain, and was so named largely because Spain, being neutral in the war, reported on it openly while combatant nations suppressed the news to maintain morale. This pandemic infected an astonishing portion of the human race. Something on the order of 500 million people, roughly a third of everyone alive at the time, are estimated to have been infected, and the death toll ran into the tens of millions worldwide, with some estimates placing it far higher than the war that preceded it. It spread with such ferocity, aided by the movement of troops and the conditions of the war, that it reached nearly every corner of the globe within months. What made this particular outbreak so uniquely horrifying was not just its scale, but its victims, because it violated the most basic expectation we have about how disease behaves. Ordinarily, illnesses like influenza are most dangerous to the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by other conditions, the people whose bodies are least able to mount a strong defense. This pandemic did something different and far more frightening. It killed the young and healthy in extraordinary numbers, striking down robust adults in the prime of their lives, people whose strong, vigorous immune systems should have been their best protection. And the cruel mechanism behind this paradox lay precisely in the strength of those immune systems. The explanation that has emerged points to a phenomenon sometimes described as a cytokine storm, in which the body's own immune response rather than the virus itself becomes the primary agent of harm. In the strongest, healthiest individuals, the immune system could overreact so violently to the infection that it essentially turned on the body it was meant to protect, flooding the system with an inflammatory response so massive and uncontrolled that it overwhelmed the lungs and the body's vital functions. The very vigour that should have been a young adult's greatest asset became, in this case, a fatal liability. Their powerful defences, mobilised too aggressively against the invader, did the damage that killed them. It is a genuinely unsettling reversal, the idea that being strong and healthy could be precisely what doomed you, and it remains one of the most sobering chapters in the history of pandemics. Yet for all the horror of the Great Plague and the Great Influenza, neither holds the grim title of the deadliest disease in human history. That distinction almost certainly belongs to a different killer, one that stalked humanity for thousands of years, that scarred and blinded and killed across every inhabited continent, and that is now the subject of one of the proudest achievements our species has ever managed. Smallpox is thought by many to have killed more human beings over the long course of history than any other single disease, a steady, relentless reaper that took an incalculable toll across millennia, striking rich and poor, powerful and humble alike, and leaving survivors permanently marked. It was a constant, dreaded presence in human life for as far back as the records reach. The most catastrophic single chapter in this long history came when the disease was carried across the ocean to the Americas, with consequences so devastating they almost defy belief, and it is a chapter that must be told with real sobriety. When contact was established between the Old World and the populations of the Americas, the diseases that the arriving Europeans carried with them, smallpox foremost among them, encountered populations that had never been exposed to them, and therefore had no built-up resistance whatsoever. The result was one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The diseases tore through the indigenous populations of the Americas with a lethality that is hard to fully grasp, and across the affected regions the loss of life reached almost unimaginable proportions, with the indigenous population in many areas collapsing by figures approaching 90% in the generations that followed contact. Whole civilizations were brought to the brink and beyond, not primarily by conquest in battle, but by invisible microbes against which the people had no defense. It is a stark and tragic reminder of how profoundly the unseen world of disease has shaped the course of human events, often far more decisively than any army. But the story of smallpox, almost uniquely among the great killers, has an ending, and it is a triumphant one that stands as a testament to human ingenuity at its best. Toward the end of the 18th century, an English physician named Edward Jenner made an observation that would change the world. He noticed that people who worked closely with cattle and had caught a mild related disease called cowpox seemed to be protected from the far deadlier smallpox. Working from this observation, in 1796 he carried out the experiment that founded the science of vaccination, deliberately exposing a person to the mild cowpox material and then demonstrating that this exposure protected them from smallpox. The principle he established, that a controlled, harmless exposure could train the body to defend itself against a deadly disease, became one of the most powerful tools in all of medicine, and the very word vaccination derives from this work involving cattle. What followed, over the next nearly 2 centuries, was a slow, determined global campaign to use this tool to push back against a disease that had tormented humanity since the dawn of recorded history. Through coordinated international effort on a scale rarely matched, the disease was hunted down across the entire planet, outbreak by outbreak, region by region, until it had nowhere left to hide. And then, in 1980, the achievement was made official. Smallpox was declared eradicated, wiped from the face of the earth entirely, the first and to this day essentially the only human disease ever deliberately driven to extinction by our own efforts. A scourge that had killed more people than perhaps any other across all of history simply ceased to exist as a threat, eliminated not by chance, but by deliberate, patient, coordinated human action. After everything the disease had inflicted across thousands of years, humanity reached up and switched it off, which stands as one of the most genuinely magnificent things our species has ever accomplished. It is worth holding on to that fact as a counterweight to all the folly and misjudgment we have catalogued, because the same species that ate arsenic for its complexion and ignored a doctor with a street map also, when it finally pointed its ingenuity and cooperation in the right direction, erased an ancient killer from the world forever. From the unseen enemies that shaped our biology, we turn finally to a danger of an entirely different kind, one that humanity built with its own hands and that occasionally turned on its makers with spectacular violence. For our last story, we leave behind the world of germs and mines and step into the age of iron, steam, and raw mechanical power, to a technology that gave people a thrilling new kind of speed and that, every so often, exploded directly in their faces. The steam locomotive was one of the defining machines of its era, the roaring, smoking, thundering engine that shrank distances, knit nations together, and hauled the modern world into being. But to appreciate the danger lurking inside it, you need a basic picture of how the thing actually worked, and the principle, while simple, was genuinely fearsome once you understand the forces involved. At the heart of every steam locomotive was a boiler, a large metal vessel containing water, and beneath or within it a roaring fire, the firebox, burning coal to heat that water. As the water boiled, it produced steam, and crucially, that steam was contained under enormous pressure inside the sealed boiler, building up to forces that could reach a few £100 per square inch. To get more power, the water was heated well beyond the ordinary boiling point you would see in a kitchen kettle, becoming superheated water held at temperatures far above the normal boiling point, well over 400 degrees Fahrenheit, kept liquid only by the immense pressure pressing down upon it. And there is the hidden menace, the principle that made these machines a potential bomb on wheels. That superheated water was only staying in liquid form because of the tremendous pressure. The instant that pressure was suddenly released, the water would no longer be able to remain liquid at such a temperature, and it would flash all at once into steam. The trouble is that water expands enormously when it turns to steam, increasing in volume by a vast factor in a fraction of a second. So a boiler full of superheated water under pressure was holding within it the potential for a catastrophic, near instantaneous expansion, a violent release of energy waiting for any failure that would let the pressure go. Under normal operation, with everything functioning as designed, this energy was harnessed safely to drive the wheels. But if something went wrong, if the containment failed, that stored energy could be unleashed all at once with devastating force. The single most illustrative example of exactly how this could go wrong occurred in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, on the 13th of May, 1948, in Chillicothe, Ohio, and it involved a specific locomotive that has become a textbook case of boiler catastrophe. The chain of events came down to a single critical requirement of operating these machines safely, which was maintaining the correct water level inside the boiler. The water served a vital dual purpose. It produced the steam, of course, but it also kept the metal of the boiler, particularly the crown sheet above the firebox, safely covered and cooled. As long as the hot metal was submerged in water, it stayed at a safe temperature. If the water level dropped too low and exposed that hot metal directly to the roaring fire, the metal would rapidly overheat and weaken. On that day, as the locomotive was working hard climbing a grade, which tilts the engine and can cause the water inside the boiler to slosh toward the back and away from the critical front portions, the water level over the crucial heated metal apparently fell dangerously low. The exposed metal, no longer protected by its blanket of water, overheated severely and lost its strength. And then came the fatal moment, the sudden reintroduction of water onto that dangerously overheated metal. When water once again reached the superheated, weakened surface, it did not gently top up the supply. It flashed instantly and violently into an enormous volume of steam, a sudden massive pressure spike that the already weakened metal could not contain. The boiler failed catastrophically, and the stored energy was released all at once in a tremendous explosion that destroyed the locomotive. It was a stark and tragic demonstration of the physics we just described. The textbook scenario of low water, overheated metal, and a sudden flashing of water into steam, playing out with deadly force. Now, it would be easy to assume from a story like that these machines were exploding left and right, scattering wreckage across the countryside on a regular basis. But the actual statistics tell a more measured story, and they are worth laying out plainly. Across a very long span of time, from the early days of steam in the early 19th century all the way into the late 1970s, the number of these dramatic boiler explosions that were properly documented comes to around 53 incidents, with a total death toll across all of them of roughly 150 people. The worst single incident claimed somewhere in the region of 24 lives, an event that occurred in the early 20th century, and that investigators came to suspect was not a simple accident at all, but possibly the result of deliberate tampering, a case of sabotage rather than mechanical failure. When you spread 53 serious explosions and around 150 deaths across well over a century of operation, during which these locomotives made countless millions of journeys, hauling enormous tonnages of freight and passengers, the actual risk to any individual traveller begins to look rather different from the terrifying image the word explosion conjures. These were spectacular and frightening when they happened, but in the grand scheme of the railway age they were genuinely rare events. It is worth appreciating that the relative rarity of these disasters was not a happy accident, but the result of hard-won engineering wisdom, much of it learned the difficult way. Over the decades, builders developed an array of safety features specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophe we have described. There were safety valves engineered to automatically release pressure before it could climb to a dangerous level, venting excess steam harmlessly rather than letting it build toward a rupture. There were gauges and glass tubes that let the crew see the water level at a glance, so they could keep that vital protective layer topped up. And in a particularly clever piece of design, boilers were often fitted with a fusible plug, a small component made of a metal that would melt at a specific high temperature. If the water dropped too low and the crucial metal began to overheat, this plug would melt first, deliberately venting steam into the firebox to dampen the fire and alert the crew that something was badly wrong, a built-in early warning system that sacrificed itself to prevent a far worse outcome. Combined with regular inspections and strict operating rules, these measures steadily drove down the frequency of explosions, which is precisely why 53 serious incidents across well over a century represents not rampant danger, but a technology that was, through painful experience, gradually tamed. This raises a natural question. If the explosions were so rare, and if they were not really the defining danger of the technology, then why did the mighty steam locomotive eventually disappear almost entirely, replaced by the diesel engines that haul freight today? And the answer is one of the more quietly instructive lessons in the whole history of technology, because it had almost nothing to do with safety or with explosions and almost everything to do with cold, unglamorous economics. The steam locomotive did not die because it was dangerous. It died because it was expensive and inefficient compared to what came next. Diesel engines were simply cheaper to run, cleaner in operation, and far less labour-intensive. A steam locomotive was a hungry, demanding beast that required constant attention, vast quantities of coal and water, and a sizable crew to operate and maintain, typically needing multiple people working it at once. A diesel engine, by contrast, could be operated by a single person, needed far less maintenance, did not require the elaborate infrastructure of water towers and coaling stations dotted along every route, and did not spend hours building up steam before it could even move. Faced with a machine that did the same job for a fraction of the cost and labour, the railways made the entirely predictable business decision, and the romantic age of steam gave way to the practical age of diesel, not with a bang but with a balance sheet. There is a neat parallel here to another famous disaster of the era of grand machines, one that illuminates how the reputation of a technology can be shaped far more by perception than by actual statistics. when a great airship met its fiery end in a catastrophe that became one of the most famous disasters of its time, the event seared itself into public memory and is often credited with ending the age of passenger airships almost overnight. Yet the death toll of that disaster, terrible as it was actually relatively modest compared to many other transport accidents that have faded from memory entirely. What made it so devastating to the future of the technology was not the number of lives lost, but the fact that it was captured, vividly and dramatically on film and in photographs, broadcast to a horrified public who watched the great machine consumed in flames. The catastrophe became iconic not because it was the deadliest, but because it was the most visible, the most thoroughly documented, the one people could actually see. And in the same way, the image of an exploding boiler looms far larger in the popular imagination than its modest statistical footprint would justify, a reminder that what frightens us and what actually endangers us are often two very different things, and that a single unforgettable image can outweigh a mountain of reassuring numbers. And so we reach the end of our journey through the stranger corners of the past, from a poison swallowed for beauty to a river that built a city, from a boy who appeared out of nowhere to a disease that humanity finally erased from existence. The thread running through all of it, if there is one, is simply that the real history of our species is far weirder, darker, and more surprising than the tidy version we're usually handed, full of people who were doing their best with the knowledge they had, getting things gloriously wrong, and occasionally, against all odds, getting something magnificently right. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and for letting these old stories keep you company tonight. It has been a genuine pleasure to share them with you. Now rest easy, let your mind drift away from plagues and boilers and poisons, and drift off gently. Good night to all of you, and the sweetest of dreams.